everyone, Novels Wonderland here. Thank you all for the love and support you've shown me and the channel.
Reborn is the first Nephilim chapter 61 to 70, chapter 56 chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Lucian briefed Emma on the situation and what he wanted done after the quick meet and greet was over. Once he told her all that he wanted done, the Primordial took off running and started organizing the various peoples together. Seeing that his newest subordinate had this well in hand, the Nephilim decided to now focus on the last preparations before heading off to Eurasania. Mainly, who he'd be taking with him. After some deliberation, though, he had the lineup he wanted in mind. First was Alice and Alfred, the duo perfect to serve as his entourage, with them covering magical and physical combat. Next was Kushina, her chains perfect for subduing opponents non-lethally, and her tailed beast serving as a great way to gain numbers should it come to it. Finally was Surtur for his defensive abilities and his area of effect attacks, being the perfect tank and deterrent should Lucian's challenge result in them facing an army. The fact that the fire giant now also had a dragon following him around like a lost puppy in the form of Ignis also helped serve as a deterrent, he felt. Lucian nodded to himself at the roster he'd made for himself. Now to split up the rest so they can do the most good, he thought to himself as he looked on at his other subordinates. Ivy and Harley would be staying with the freedmen. Harley so as to help the now freed and traumatized people as best she could, while Ivy would be a massive help for the people's food. Airy would be going with them as well, since she had seemed to latch onto Harley pretty well, and the blonde being the best suited to helping her for now. Historia would also be going with them for similar reasons as Ivy, and to give Airy a friend. Alex wished to get back to their spy den as well, so they were heading to the mountainside hideaway as well. That left only two more of Lucian's followers, and he had something different in mind for. So he walked up to where Bullet and Shirzwa were talking and cleared his throat to get their attention. "I've got something I need you two to do," he told them, getting both to turn around and look at him. Both stood at attention from his words, Bullet looking like the stereotypical soldier in that moment, with the blonde beside him seeming to try his best to copy him. The sight of the delinquent like Shirzwa trying to look like a soldier ready for orders almost made Lucian laugh, but he kept it in. "What's your order, boss?" Bullet asked with not a bit of sarcasm, like what Lucian had slightly expected, the nod from Shirzwa even less. Rolling with the respect they showed him, the Nephilim cut to the point. "I need you two to go with Blake and help in his endeavors to get this nation under control. Have a feeling that this is where you'll do the most good. Plus, I think Richard would like to see his old friends again, don't you think?" He said that last part with a smile and got matching smirks from the two. The two summoned otherworlders nodded at his orders and headed off to the human camp where Blake had gone. Lucian was glad to see it, having them there to aid his brother put his mind at ease. Honestly, Lucian wished to help more personally but knew he couldn't. Would doing so make his brother's authority be in constant question and severely negatively impact his reputation, making it seem as though if not for a demon lord he would not be king, but it would also make the other human nations more uneasy. Perhaps even uneasy enough to do something like declare a holy war or something similar. Then there was the factor of time that needed to be taken into account. In short, Lucian didn't have the time to go help personally, or to have Blake wait until he did. Right now he was a demon lord in power, but without the title, and without the resources to this left him vulnerable, and with more and more people coming under him he needed those resources. Without them his new people would likely abandon him. Lucian was now also seen as a threat, but one without backing of the Demon Lord Council. That made him a tempting target of all kinds of people, in essence becoming a prime target for those wishing to kill a powerful monster. So he aimed to cement his position by challenging Carrion, and thus also gaining all his territory in one fell swoop. This would grant him the recognition of the world as well, and make it so others would be far more hesitant to challenge him. He'd go from a walking calamity that needed to be killed, to a powerful ruler that was to be treated with caution. Difference was important. Blake also needed to act quickly in order to head off the worst of the effects of the conflict. Soon nobles would hear of what happened and start scheming for the throne, Alex's reports letting them know that plenty of houses coveted the throne. Civil war would break out soon, and foreign powers would be trying to get all they could from the corpse of the nation. Lucian was also wary of giving the Council of the West, primarily Granbell, any time to act. They were dangerous in their ambition, and with their slowly growing army of enslaved otherworlders known as Blood Shadow, they had the power to act on those ambitions. In truth, I wish I could just eliminate him and his cohorts, but that would kick off a conflict of epic proportions. Best case scenario, the Empire takes advantage of the chaos and tries to conquer the world early. Worst case, Guy takes it as an action that would upset the balance he'd worked so hard to maintain as the mediator for the last few thousand years and tries to kill me for it. I may be stronger now, but I don't think I have a snowball's chance in hell of betting that old monster, Lucian thought to himself with a sigh. In the end, Blake needed to act now in order to get the nation once known as Malstance under. Lucian's worries about Granbell and his council would have to wait until there was a better opportunity to deal with them. That or he grew strong enough to no longer care about what Guy thought. Though he felt that was a ways off for him. I'm not Rimuru and am not capable of becoming more powerful than a millennia-old demon lord in less than a decade. Not yet anyway. He spoke to himself aloud before sighing once he walked off to go tell the others his orders before heading off. Soon, he would challenge the lion for his throne though, and that was a fight he had no fear in losing. Blake walked into the camp where Richard's men were and looked on at the soldiers. He knew many of them, even spotting some that he'd lead during the troll incident, and he saw them all smile his way. They were happy to see him, to see a comrade in arms once more after months away. It made the redhead smile himself at it all. He kept following Richard though until they were in front of the whole camp, Noctis standing to the side with the men started to whisper to each other until the young commander called for their attention. Silence greeted them all at once after the order was given. Men, I have an announcement. We have fought and bled for rulers that cared not for us, who gave no thought to the ones they sent to die in the dirt while they lived in finery. Followed their orders with devotion only to be met with scorn. Fought their battles only to be told it should be our honor to die for them, those who watched on as our friends and family struggled to survive. Richard began his speech to his men, Blake surprised at the passion in the young man's voice. The men looked at one another and murmured their agreement with their commander. Richard went on though. How many of you have lost someone from the greed of these so-called nobles? Have lost friends and family, lovers and neighbors to their commands? Forced conscription, unfair taxes, nobles abusing authority and people vanishing without a trace only for those in charge to do nothing. All these sins lay at their feet, not just the now-ended royal family. Well, I say no more. No more shall we be looked down upon, be treated as expendable or be ordered to die with a blade in hand by those who never have seen the horrors they send us, he shouted for them all to hear, riling the men up into a frenzy as all their grievances were laid bare for them, and that which they had felt for so long was finally spoken aloud. The crowd of men shouted their agreements and of their wrath at the nobles. It was then that one of the men shouted out the question that Richard had been waiting for. "And what are you going to do about it?" the soldier asked, not mockingly but in a genuine want to know. Richard spoke up once more at that, the answer on his lips. "I say we stop fighting for those pounces. We all know they will be scrambling after this, trying to claim the empty throne. Well, I have someone better for that crown, someone who deserves to lead us, and who you all know well." The brown-haired man shouted out his words before doing something none of them had expected. Richard took out the sword at his hip and stabbed it into the ground before going to his knees. There in front of all his men the young commander knelt to Blake and shouted out words that would surely go into the history books. "I chose Blake Brightheart as my king. The man who aided us when we were at our lowest, who fought and bled with us. So I name him my king, from this day till my last." He shouted out for all his men to hear. Then, one by one, the assembled army of men knelt to him. Once all had knelt, something that took less than a minute, a war cry left their throats. "We name him as our king, and we shall accept no other," was the roar that left them. Blake was shocked that this was all it seemed to take. That now before him he had these men pledging themselves to him. But he knew he must say something now to them. It was something he felt the need to do from the bottom of his soul. Rise, men. You who have sworn to me, who I have fought beside and trusted with my life. Swear to you all that with me as your king I shall fight for you. I shall end the terror that you and your people have faced from those in power. I will rule for the people, for the common men, for I am one of you. I may be a humble boy from a no-name village, but I shall use that to rule with you in mind. So men, follow me for a better tomorrow for you and yours. Tomorrow where a man's birth does not define them. One where skill and talent matter more than birthright. And one where injustice shall be punished, no matter who they are. Yelled out, rallying the men even more at the declaration of his ideals. As the men shouted his name in recognition of his words, Blake thought back to something his brother once told him. Of a hero who lived by these words, with great power comes great responsibility. He had found those words to resonate with him, and now Blake had now he'd found his responsibility. To lead the people to a better tomorrow, and to end the reign of those that have abused their power, and not fulfilled their responsibilities. If no one else is willing or able to do so, then it falls to me, he thought to himself, taking on this burden as he realized the true weight of being king. And he swore he would not shirk this weight like the kings and rulers that humanity had grown so used to. No, for he was strong, and he would hold this weight up, and never let it, this he vowed. Luminous sat on her throne and listened as 3 of her most faithful retainers discussed the new events going on in the world. Lewis was reporting on the activities of their government. Mainly how well their trade and industry was going, as that was his department as the cloistered emperor. He managed the reports and such of the nation's infrastructure, and he used to run the church forces as well. Though the later duties had suffered as he had far too much to do managing the economy and legal side of the nation. Luckily Hinata had more or less taken that position over, and had a good grip on the church after uniting the Crusaders and the Master Rooks. Roy on the other hand spoke about the non-humans under her rule, mainly vampires, and the territories set aside for them away from the major human settlements. He was the demon lord of her territory to the public, taking over the role that she'd once fulfilled. It was far more than just scaring the humans, and making a grand show of being a foe to the church after all, though he did it well. That left her to her own projects and devices ever since the two had taken over, even more so with Hinata joining them. A long time ago Luminous had been a more hands-on ruler, instead of having delegated everything the way she does now. Those were the days of her beautiful Night Rose though, and after its destruction she had been less involved ever since. In part she knew it was something she did to protect herself. She had loved her city, took pride in it and loved her when that stupid lizard destroyed it. She had been incredibly angry, but in the aftermath, she had decided to distance herself from those she ruled. The sadness she had felt was great, and she wished not to experience it ever again. Since then, she'd become more cold in a way. More distant than she used to be and less open with her. It was only the future version of the woman who stood before her giving a report of the movements of the Crusaders that had gotten her out of her rut. It was with this thought in mind that she brought up something to her cohort. "And what is the news of the new demon lord that has likely arisen in the south?" she asked, wanting more information on Lucian Silver. "It seems that he has left the battlefield and is heading further south. From what our sources say, it seems he is heading to either Demon Lord Fry or Carrion's domain with a small group. Though the reason why is not known," Hinata told her after flipping through a packet of papers for the report. That's good then. Lewis, prepare for Valpurgis to be called soon. I shall be accompanying you this time as well," she ordered her faithful subordinate at the news, getting odd looks from them all but none questioned her. Luminous gave a token effort to pay attention to the reports after that, her mind elsewhere. She thought back on all she'd been told of that man. Of Lucian Silver, and what he would come to do. In many ways, she was quite looking forward to seeing this man for herself. She'd not known her friend to over-exaggerate after all, and thus it made this Silver King all the more fascinating to her. Edited, February 14, 2026 Chapter End Notes. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote, after you remove the spaces. Chapter 62, Chapter 57 Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Lucian and his group were making good time heading to Eurasania, having covered over half the distance in only a few days due to them all possessing above-human speed. It was mainly, as always seemed to be the case for him, the lack of any true road or defined path to their destination that slowed them down. If they had something like what Rimura made in canon, then he was sure they'd probably already be there by now. It was just another thing to think about for what civil works projects he would see about implementing once he had a nation under his command. It was as he was camping that night, though only a few short days away from the Beast Kingdom, that he decided to try something that had been a long time coming. Puriel, do you think I possess enough magicals to name you? And if I do, what would that mean for you and your skill? Lucian asked the angelic skill, as he looked at the smoldering. The others had gone to bed, as it was his turn to keep watch for the night. His ability to not need sleep was helpful in times like this, though he wasn't the only one of the group with such an advantage. Still, he had set up a system where each member of the group that didn't need sleep would rotate on watch duty. Just because he and the demon twins didn't require sleep to function didn't mean sleep wasn't helpful and rejuvenating for them after all. Him be the only one awake right now, and thus able to give more of his focus to his skill. You are in possession of enough magicals to name the fledgling ego inside the ultimate skill Puriel. However, all automatic processes, such as performing actions I have anticipated you would find useful, will no longer be done while undergoing evolution into a proper living being, was Puriel's answer to his question. Lucian sighed out, both happy that he was strong enough to name them, but a tad wary about not having that bit of extra aid. So he asked the next most logical question. How long do you think you'd be out of commission after naming then? He asked, hoping for a favorable reply. According to calculations, no longer than a week, and no shorter than 3 days. Puriel told him after a moment to run the calculations they spoke of. That made Lucian focus inward, running through his plans, and how this could affect them. He really wanted Puriel to evolve into a Manus before meeting the other demon lords, mainly Guy. The Nephilim didn't want to go in without every precaution he could get due to how unpredictable things could get. That said, though, he wasn't overly concerned about fighting Carrion, all things considered. Plus what he intended would give him time anyway, so all would hopefully work out. With all this in mind, he decided to go for it. Then, from this day forth I name you Petra, Lucian declared to his skill, and felt a massive drain on his magicals. From what he could tell, it seemed like close to 60% of his magicals were taken by naming her. More than even Emma had taken from him, and he'd given her 2 names. Just went to show how much potential a Manus had, it seemed. As for the name he chose, it was honestly pretty simple in its origin. Lucian named her after Saint Peter, the one who greets souls entering heaven. Petra is just the female version of the name Peter, simple but effective, he felt. Plus, one of my favorite games had a character named Petra, he thought with a smile. Wondering how this may affect the final appearance of the now named Petra. Alongside the drain on his magicals, Lucian also felt something go dormant inside him. Had grown so used to Puriel's presence in his soul that now that her ego was dormant he felt the shift. It was quite odd for him, like a part of him was slumbering while he stayed awake, but not quite. In the end, though, he just hoped he made the right decision in naming her now instead of later. Bullet walked into the middle of what seemed to be some kind of rally alongside Shirzwa. They had headed off to go meet up with Blake in order to grant him some help, and now were wading through cheering soldiers. Once they got to the front, they saw the men they were looking for, the redhead somehow having galvanized the troops onto his side in the short time they'd spent apart. It made Bullet laugh a bit, a genuine smile on his face at the sight. Bullet had served those undeserving of power before, and Blake felt like the total opposite of he honestly believed the young man would make a good ruler in time. It was what made him so happy to have received this assignment from Lucian, that and being able to see the other young man that he'd come to call friend. It seemed as though he'd get to meet up with him soon as Richard spotted him and Shurzwa in the crowd and motioned for them to come. The former revolutionary was more than happy to oblige. Standing in front of the young commander for the first time in months, Bulut took a good look. He was worried about the guy after leaving, afraid he'd be punished for losing a valuable military asset, after he and Shurzwa escaped and pretended to be dead. He was more than familiar with the military blame game, and the punishments that could be meted out by those in charge should they be cruel enough. Thankfully, if anything, Richard looked better than when he'd last seen the brown-haired man. Richard looked healthier in a way, less skinny for one. He'd filled out more and looked broader than before. Bulut figured a more steady diet, and him being in the prime time of growth for his life made that possible. The rations they had on their deployment against the trolls hadn't been the most nutritious after all, and then even that started to thin as the months. It was no surprise then to see the young man filled out more with a more steady source of food. Though it was the look in Richard's eyes that most caught his attention. The eyes staring back at him were that of a man on a mission. Determination brimmed in those eyes, and that look combined with his coloring made Bulut remember Tatsumi in a way. Both young men who wanted to change the nation they were born in, and both fighting far too young. It made him need to take a deep breath to center himself once more at the memories that flooded him. In the end, though, he greeted his old friend with a smile and a pat on the back. "Looks like you're finally getting some muscles on those bones of yours." He teased the young man playfully. The fact that Richard stumbled from the slap on the back only made everyone chuckle at the scene. Richard rubbed the back of his head as he stood up after that, a sheepish expression on his. "Well, yeah, got to try and catch up to you, man. Been training like you showed me since you've been gone," Richard told him, a smirk on his face that was equal parts joy and pride. Bulut just laughed for a moment before speaking up once again. "Glad to hear it. Maybe one day you'll be able to out-muscle me, man," he said with a teasing lift to his voice still. Shurzwa just looked on and shook his head at the two with a smile on his face. "Those two get along like a house on fire. I just wish I wasn't in it sometimes," the blonde thought to himself with a huff-like chuckle escaping his lips. After the small reunion, Richard led them all into his tent for some privacy to discuss their next move. He had the commander's tent, so there was room for all of them. Blake took the head seat of the small table that was inside the tent, the noble they had inside named Noctis sitting to his left while Richard sat to his right. Bulut and Shurzwa stood behind the redhead, looking like some form of knightly guard without the armor. Blake seemed to take a deep breath before addressing everyone. He first turned to Noctis to ask his initial question. "Lord Noctis, how many men are left alive in this camp, and how many do you think we can rally to our side?" He asked the most pertinent question for their immediate future. The Lord put his hand to his chin in thought for a moment before answering. "From the last reports, I'd say close to 7,000 men are left on the field now. Surviving mercenaries fled after the attack, and many men from the army flat out deserted afterwards as well. Then there's the fact that a few nobles have called back their troops, all of them being nobles that didn't come to the battlefield themselves, of course. That leaves roughly 7,000 men, most just waiting for orders that'll never come, with their liege dead," Noctis informed them all as he answered Blake's question. Bulut was shocked to say the least, and from the look in Blake's eyes he wasn't the only one. The human part of the army had numbered over 20,000 before the attack, and now less than half that number remained. It did make sense though, thousands dying in the attack and likely at least 1,000 deserters during the chaos. Those that deserted were most likely from the conscripted levies, those with little training, and even less loyalty to the kingdom that had sent them to die. That combined with everything else Noctis mentioned, the number made sense. Now it was just a matter of the Lord's answer to the other half of Blake's. "As for how many we could get under your banner, I'd say at least half. A large number of the survivors were from the levies, and such, so I imagine they'd be rather easy to get on side after this mess. That combined with the men under me and the men under the surviving nobles that I've been feeling out these past few months, should total up to close to half. It's just a matter of doing something to rally them," Noctis finished, and his words left Blake in thought on what to do. Bullet understood this was likely a difficult thing to try and come up with. A speech was unlikely to be enough for them, a demonstration of power was needed as well. This world followed strength, even the humans did if to a lesser extent than monsters. More though, humans followed legends. A hero king was a well-known phenomena after all. Flocked to those who surpassed being a normal human, whether out of belief in them or out of survival instinct. Blake had the bearing of a hero, he now needed to prove his power as one to the people. The easiest way would be to achieve a war victory, but that was not something they could pull right now. It was then though as Bullet was lost in thought as to what to do that Blake spoke. "I think I have an idea," he said in a calm voice brimming with will. Richard spoke next, asking the question they all had. "And what would this plan be?" the young commander asked. Blake looked around the room then before asking Noctis a question. "Are there any nobles left that are problematic?" Blake asked, and everyone in the room perked up waiting for Noctis's answer. The noble thought for a moment before smiling. "Why, by chance there is." Emma made her way to the mountain hideaway one of her new master's subordinates had set up, leading the group of freed slaves to it as per the instructions she had been given. Smiled at the thought though, at having a master at all. Never in her endless existence did she think someone powerful enough to be her master would come and ask her to be their subordinate. The fact that she'd been given a name as well was equally surprising to her. Was a being that had been alive since the dawn of creation, and she had encountered scant few with the power needed to name her. Rouge was one of course, though others existed. Most were dead now, lost to the flow of time. Or from the hands of one who found their strength as a challenge. It was the way of things she'd found that the strong often died because of that strength. Emma just hoped that her new master would not fall into such a fate. Focusing more on the present though, she soon reached the mountainside settlement and introduced herself to those waiting for her. Alex, the young demon her lord had somehow made, spoke up and made the introductions go smoothly. She was grateful for the help from the young one. Emma did not feel like causing a scene right now, and was always happy when things went smoothly for her. At least when it came to logistics and organization. Once she was given the reins and introduced, she started giving out orders to get everyone seen to and put to work for those that were able. New housing needed to be made, even if temporary, and resources catalogued. She directed Ivy, another fellow subordinate of her new lord that intrigued her, to begin setting up fields for crops in order to feed the large number of people now under her purview. The green-skinned woman huffed a bit but did as told. She was not a very sociable woman, Emma had found, but that was fine. She continued to get everything in order, hoping that her efforts would be appreciated by her new master. This was the time to show her worth, she felt, and she was not one to fall short. As everything was getting underway though, she began to contemplate her future. Particular what she would do with the large number of subordinates she had under herself. It would be nice to have some people whose competence I can be assured of. That would require me to go back to the demon realm though, and it would be ill-mannered of me to simply leave without the permission of my new lord. Something to ask about when he returns, I suppose, Emma thought to herself as she kept going around the encampment to get everything organized. Edited, February 14, 2026. Chapter End Notes. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote after you remove the spaces. Chapter 63, Chapter 58. Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Blake was told about one of the few nobles still present that had survived the attack by his, from what Noctis said, the man was cowardly and never wished to fight himself. That alone was not reason enough to use the man for his plan, but his connections to the slave trade were. Just because this Count Marcus was not one who wished to fight against a superior foe, didn't mean he wasn't a cruel bastard. His territory was a known vacation spot in the kingdom. It was not the views though that made it such, but rather the entertainment that the various slaves were forced into doing for the pleasure of the elite. The redhead had used the thought communication technique his brother had shown him that let him talk to any who had been named by his brother regardless of distance. This allowed him to consult Alex and gain further insight into the Count. The spider demon had found out much about the man, it turned out. In particular, it was said that his domain held the highest slave population in the nation. What really cinched it all, though, was the fact that Marcus actively took members of his own citizens as new slaves quite frequently. Had the documents to prove it. With some aid of Alex's body doubles and some spatial manipulation to get copies of the documents, the plan was set. That all took place 3 days ago, and the effects could already the documents had been left out for one of the higher-up members of the army under Marcus's command to see. That was done instead of just spreading them among the men directly to ensure someone who could actually read got a hold of them. And if that soldier just so happened to have a missing sister, well, that was just fortunate happenstance. That happened, the information spread like wildfire, the men having nothing else to do but talk and tell stories at this point while they waited for those in charge to give them orders. It spread from soldier to soldier, camp to camp, until almost everyone knew about it. Was when Blake struck. Making his way to Count Marcus's camp with Schurzwa, Bullet, and Richard behind him, he soon stood in front of all the men under Marcus's command. Stopped him, in part because Richard was there and they believed it may be a military matter. That thought was crushed when Blake spoke. Count Marcus, I have found that you are involved heavily in the trading of slaves. Allow such injustice to stand, especially from one who was meant to protect his people. Such I challenge you here, and now to a duel to the death. The would-be king declared, for all this part of the plan was also calculated. For Count Marcus could not refuse such a duel outright according to the laws of Malstance. Malstance was a nation founded by a warlord, and many laws still remained that reflected that. One such law being that if challenged to a duel to the death after being accused of a crime, which slavery technically was, even if the nobility hardly followed that law, they must respond or be considered guilty. As such, Marcus couldn't simply dismiss this declaration from Blake or be seen as admitting to his own guilt. So Count Marcus left his tent in a sweeping motion, trying to look noble when his appearance made him look anything but. Count Marcus was a chubby man, rotund in the way that only large amounts of inactivity could lead to. He was balding at the top of his head as well, only wisps of blonde hair remaining. Several of his teeth were fake as well, being made of silver or gold. All this wouldn't be too out of the ordinary for an aging lord. No shame in it. The thing was, this man was only in his late 20s, and had already done quite considerable damage to his body from his vices. The fact that his face was flushed red from drink only made it all the worse. He was dressed in a yellow doublet and black breeches, fine leather shoes on his feet, and gloves on his hands. Gold accessories spotted his body, showing off the wealth that all of that wealth came from the efforts of slaves, for besides that industry there were no other true major sources of revenue that could support such a lifestyle that the Count preferred. It was once the overly dressed lout was in front of Blake that he spoke up in his nastily superior-sounding voice. "And what gives a commoner like you the right to spot such drivel?" he asked, relying on his status to get him out of this. That was another part of the law, a commoner could not issue a challenge like this to a noble. "Well, except for one caveat. I give him the right." Count Marcus Noctis spoke up then from the side, bringing with him all his men and many of the scattered men as well. The one way for a commoner to be able to issue a challenge like this to a noble was to have the backing of another noble. Marcus knew this, of course, and it made him frown, but he wasn't concerned quite yet. "Very well then, Lord Noctis, if this is how you want to play things, then I will use my right to declare a champion in my stead," the Blackheart noble said before motioning towards his one guard. Unbeknownst to the men under his command, this guard was not like the rest. He wasn't a sworn sword or a soldier of great skill, he was a slave from the gladiator pits that had a seal on his chest that enforced the commands his master gave him. It was a slave trade specialty, though only possible to put on someone who was below a certain level of power. Slaves needed more showy pieces of magic to keep them in line, such as collars and chains. Blake knew however from Alex that this man before him was equivalent to a B-rank adventurer, having grown stronger in the pits after being marked. Marcus thus used the men to settle things that required more muscle than normal, or to intimidate others. As such he used the right of nobles to declare a champion to fight in his stead, and he chose his trusty slave for the role. Blake had to admit it was a good choice in champion. The enslaved man stood over 6 feet tall, and had muscles so big and strong they almost tore through his cotton shirt when he flexed to move. It was likely only the chainmail he wore that would survive him properly moving, Blake thought. Very well, then let us begin. Right here, right now. Blake shouted out in response to the Count's choice. A perimeter was quickly established as the soldiers gave the fighters a large berth. Marcus chose as his champion stood opposite Blake, and the two stared at one another. At some unseen signal both launched themselves at the other. The man whose name Blake did not know threw a haymaker at his face that Blake quickly blocked with his forearm. Mun and Marcus were surprised to see Blake not even move an inch from the blow. Made the enslaved man smile despite himself, the promise of a true opponent making his blood pump. The two exchanged blow after blow in a slugfest that kicked up dust around them from the weapons were allowed in these fights, but Blake knew the men before him knew not how to wield any, the pits being hand-to-hand mostly. As such he decided to fight on the same playing field for now by only using his hands. The fight went on though, and both began to have more and more fun. Eventually the two separated and Blake asked the now panting man a question. "You are a fine fighter. I must ask, what is your name?" he asked the man, making him pause. The large man had not been asked such a question in some time. His true name was lost in a haze most days, having been taken from him as a boy and replaced first by a number, and then a title when he began winning in the pits. His life had become a blur of fighting and guarding his master, never called anything but you or his title if the Lord was feeling like boasting. But this fight, this exchange of fists made him think back. In truth he loved fighting and proving his strength, it was how he'd survived as long as he had. But the joy he once felt in it was long gone until now. Now his head was clearer, his rut of numb acceptance shocked out of him by the blows of his opponent. And as such, his name came to him then. He began before shouting it into the sky, Tristan. Blake smiled at the sight and held his hand out, the hand becoming enveloped in a glow. Well then Tristan, as gratitude for such a fun fight, I shall set you free, the would-be king shouted back as a sword manifested in his hand. It was this act that made Marcus from the sidelines finally remember where he'd heard the name Blake before. The Count had not put together that this man was also the so-called hero of the Troll War. But seeing the man create a blade out of nothing made it all the clearer. Tristan didn't care about any of this though. No, he was far more focused on the fight. Knew then that Blake was holding back, and now with a sword his death was assured. He smiled. In a way he was glad this was the outcome. I'd rather die here against an honorable man, one that shall bring Marcus's crimes to light and punish them, than to die in the pits or save that piece of shit's life from a hired killer. Death is one I can accept. Tristan thought to himself as he charged at Blake, no defense for the slave, this was his charge towards the end. One he had come to terms with, and was willing to see through. So when Blake slashed the sword through his body, and Tristan felt something seep out of him, he was prepared to go to the afterlife, and see his mother again. Only, once he fell to the floor from the blow, and looked himself over he saw no blood. He saw instead, was the slave crest on his chest glow and disappear. It took him a moment to comprehend what he was seeing, but soon enough he laughed so hard tears began to fall from. Now free, he only had one last thing to say. I surrender. Lucian looked on at the capital city of Eurasania with a discerning eye. He was a few miles from the city currently, and he stared at the whole of the city from the viewpoint he was afforded because of that. The city was centered around one big structure in a way, a massive ziggurat-type building with a paved path leading up to it. To either side of this main road were other smaller buildings that were also part of the city. Behind the ziggurat was a large mountain, with a waterfall coming from it that backlight the structure beautifully. The city was a marvel, and should it have been made in his original world, Lucian was sure it would have been a world wonder. The problem was Lucian knew much of this city had been built on the backs of slaves. Wasn't something widely talked about, but the kingdom of Eurasania ran on slave labor for the most part. They picked the crops the nation was famous for, built the structures the king ordered, and served in other capacities as well. Most of the slaves in this nation were humans, though it was less due to discrimination, like how humans justified their own slavery. The mentality of this nation that the strong rule, and are deserving of respect, while the weak are at the whims of the strong. It was how things had always been for them, and they saw no reason to change it. Lucian was going to abuse that notion of might makes right. Once he was at the helm, he knew he would be able to make changes here. Another reason why he chose this nation to take over rather than Fry or Clayman's nations. The path to taking over this place was more clear, and had the fewest casualties involved. Should all go according to plan, there wouldn't be any deaths from this. Taking a deep breath, Lucian looked back at his travel companions and nodded his head. All knew that meant it was time to go, and so they headed off to the entrance to the city. Didn't take them long to get there with their speed, and soon enough they were in line to enter. Unlike human settlements, or really any settlement really, the guards at the gate did not necessarily check for IDs to get in. There were small cards, of course, that those who had already gone through the initial process could show to skip the test they had, but those who were coming here for the first time had to do something else to get in. As Lucian had said before, this was a nation of strength, and only the strong were allowed in the capital city. As such, they had a few people there at the gate that would be open to challengers who wished to gain entrance to the city. Should someone hold their own well enough, or beat these testers, they were allowed into the city, no questions asked. Strange system to say the least, but because everyone was so strong in the city, not many problems arose, ironically. After all, why would someone cause trouble for a local when there was a great chance the local baker could kick your ass? So when it was their turn, Lucian spoke up to the gate guard. "We're newcomers. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to get this process over with," he told the guard in a bland tone, intentionally sounding arrogant. The guard scowled, insulted somewhat that this man before him was treating this test as nothing but an inconvenience. It signaled to him that Lucian was looking down on there. As such, he gave a vicious grin, and signaled to his partner to call their strongest. "Of course, just follow my fellow guard," the tigerman said, and gestured for them to follow the other guard. Lucian smirked, having wanted just such a scenario to play out. He intended to fight the strongest they had, that way he could send a message. The message being a very simple, "Don't fuck with us." They followed the other guard, a pandaman from the looks of them, into a clearing a short distance away from the gate. There waiting for them was a behemoth of a man, nearly 10 feet tall, and had tough gray skin alongside the head of an elephant instead of the elephant. Man gave his version of a grin as he spotted them and spoke up to the "You bring some new challengers, little bear." The gray-skinned man said in a voice too deep for any human, one that sounded more like what Surtur sounded like in his giant form. The guard chuckled and told him that yes, they were challengers. The large man laughed at that and decided to mock them, the man seeming to be a cocky one. "Such puny ones dare to challenge me. What are they going to do? The pretty boy leader of theirs looks like he'd be more concerned with busting a nail than giving me a good fight," he boasted and insulted Lucian. Lucian gave a small smirk, finding the attempt at trash talk pathetic. What he hadn't accounted for was the fact that he'd brought Surtur along, and the fire giant was nothing if not loyal to him. That loyalty made him not take such insults towards Lucian lying down. The Nephilim was reminded of this fact when suddenly Surtur grew to full size, and decked the elephant man in the face, knocking him out in one punch. The guard in the crowd from the line not too far away looked gobsmacked at what they just. Meanwhile, Lucian just sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose before speaking up. "Surtur, what have I told you all about not punching people just because they insult me?" Silver-haired man said, memories of something similar happening with Alfred not too long ago making him all the more tired. Surtur being the lovable lug he is rubbed the back of his head in embarrassment as he shrunk back down. He gave a nervous chuckle at his lord's words before responding. "Ah, not to my lord," he answered, though it came out more like a question. Those words were heard by everyone there, that was still conscious at least. All that weren't with Lucian had the same thought running through their heads. He calls that guy his lord. Edited, February 23, 2026. Chapter and notes. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote, after you remove the spaces. Chapter 64, Chapter 59. Chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. After Surtur laid out the elephantmen, they were all let through in short order. Apparently seeing the fire giant call Lucian his lord made them recognize that Lucian himself was more than strong enough to enter the city. The others were let in as well after confirming that they were also his subordinates, the one exception to their rule of needing to prove your strength being if someone was following someone strong. It was initially meant more for parents and children, but it also worked for other situations commonly found in this world. Like a master and his students, or in this case someone whose strength had gotten them loyal followers. From how it was explained to Lucian, they saw it as the weaker falling under the protection of the strong, and thus deserving of respect. Otherwise it would be insulting the strong one they fell under. It was a bit complicated, but it soon made sense to him once he started thinking about it in animal terms. A wolf would not tolerate an insult to his pack, nor a lion to their pride. A similar situation here. The lycanthropes were deeply in touch with their animal side after all, and that made some of their common sense far different than a normal human. Ways it also made them more simple and straightforward, but not in a bad way. Lucian think back to what all he'd read about them from the guild library. The records, albeit heavily biased in favor of humans, talked about how the lycanthropes had some simple values in the end. The strong deserved respect, the strongest deserved to rule. You didn't like how things were being run, then get stronger and do something about it, not whine and complain. That was a core value for them that resulted in the side effect of them hating things like scheming and backstabbing politics. It was another reason why Lucian had decided to come here, less chance of having to deal with such annoyances after he took over. After being let into the city, he and his group looked around at the scenery. As mentioned before, the city was formed as a large collection of smaller buildings built around the large ziggurat in the furthest point south, where it was built at the base of the waterfall that fell from the mountains that background the city. These smaller buildings were divided into rough districts, more so something that happened as a result of similar establishments migrating towards each other than any real form of civil planning. There was a place that seemed to be full of vendors selling things like fruit and other produce, as well as others selling crated goods like leather bags and the like. Further to the east were a few stone buildings with large amounts of smoke coming from them, whose smell Lucian was able to tell meant they were likely blacksmith shops. As they walked further south towards the main building, they passed more and more different establishments, and it seemed that all the residential housing was further away from the main road. Makes sense, this is essentially Main Street for them, and that is better suited for hawking wares instead of peaceful rest, the silver-haired man thought to himself. However, he soon spied something that made him come up short. It was a bit further in, about midway between the city gate and the ziggurat, and it was a darkened street. The buildings had been getting taller and taller as they all went further in, but this street seemed to have the buildings be built so close as to cast the street in shadow no matter what time of day it was. Drew the whole group's curiosity, and so Lucian decided to take a closer look. That soon proved to be a somewhat awkward decision, as his more powerful eyes caught a sign that boasted of its wares. In particular, catnip. What made it awkward for him was to see the less than properly dressed feline lycanthrope enter the establishment. It then became apparent what this street was to him. It was this city's version of a red light district, so to Lucian then proceeded to turn right around once the implications of that set in for him. Naturally, the others wondered what was going on, not having seen what he did. It was Alice that asked the question that they all wanted to. "Why aren't we going down there?" "Aren't you curious too?" she asked, entirely innocently, but that only made it worse for Lucian in truth. The Nephilim rapidly shook his head at that before responding. "Nope, not anymore. In fact, that place is off limits," he said, trying desperately to keep his composure. He ignored the somewhat whine that Alice gave at that. "There is no way in hell I'm bringing my spawn with me into a den of likely drugs, and nah, absolutely not," Lucian thought to himself, not willing in the least to walk through such a place with two of whom could be considered his kids. Lucian was pretty sure he'd die of mortification if that were to happen. Eventually they all managed to reach the large ziggurat. Getting entrance there was surprisingly easy in comparison to entering the city, though the reason became apparent to him soon enough. The one who issued the test was spotted by Lucian inside, and it was easy enough to piece together that the man had told the guards here about them. "He likely ran here considering that we weren't that slow in getting here," Lucian thought, but soon put it aside. The inside of the structure was quite elaborate, made of polished stone that almost looked like marble, and had gold decor scattered around. This was a kind of entrance hall from what he could tell, other hallways lined on either side that lead deeper into the complex. Just the king that lived here after all. This building also served as the base for the military, and the main government building as well. At the furthest end from the entrance there was a large staircase that led to the top of the structure. That was where the king was, at the very top of this monument to strength. Before the staircase, though, to either side of it were little booths, though really they were just desks with a receptionist at each. They were there for a singular purpose, to mediate anyone who wanted to meet with the king. That made them exactly who he wanted to talk to. Once Lucian was in front of the right one, the one that happened to be closest, he cleared his throat to grab their attention. The receptionist looked at him then consideringly then. "What can I do for you?" she asked in a bored tone of voice. Lucian just gave her a smirk at that before answering. "I'd like a message passed on to King Carrion," he told her, getting an unimpressed look back. The Puma lycanthrope receptionist looked at him like he was an arrogant fool before continuing on. "And what would that be?" she asked in a bland voice that hid her slight contempt for him. Lucian knew then that she wouldn't take him seriously, something he expected. Luckily, he had a fix for that. So he leaked and directed a bit of his demon lord's hockey towards the lady, and had it lace his next words. "I want you to tell him that he has a challenger here for his position as a demon lord," he said, his power making the woman pale and shake. Lucian felt a bit bad about doing such a thing to the poor receptionist, but it was the quickest way to get things moving along. Besides, she was about B rank in terms of strength despite her position, so she should be fine. Regardless, the Puma lady nodded rapidly before standing up and running off to deliver his message. "Now we wait," he thought to himself with anticipation running through him. Tristan looked on from his position to the side, looking at the man who had defeated him with some way this red-haired man had freed him with but a slash of his sword. Longer did the burn of the control seal be felt on his chest. It made him speechless for a moment after he realized that. In the end though, he just had to ask. "How did you free me?" he asked his savior. The man, Blake was his name, looked at him with a warm smile before answering that this here, he motioned to the sword in his hand that he had summoned, is a sword imbued with the effect of dispelling curses. A slave seal like yours was a simple matter to cut through with this. The words flowed over him, shocking him at the implications. Soon the other soldiers around also soon, but together from those words the same conclusion. This man was powerful. Extremely so. The ability to make swords that could do something like dispel something as strong as a slave crest with such ease was not a common thing. In fact, it was said that one needed to have power or skill equivalent to an A rank to potentially take care of such a thing, and even then it would take concentrated effort. Yet Blake dealt with it like it was barely an inconvenience. Even the less magically knowledgeable among them could see that such strength was rare and deserving of respect. All that fell to the side though when Count Marcus began shouting from the side. "How dare you pathetic slave forfeit when fighting for me? You should have at least had the sense to die first, you pathetic waste of flesh." The noble, undeserving of such a title though he was, shouted in his rage, and showed all his true colors in that moment. After the man was done with his tirade, Blake walked up to where he stood. The crowd of people that were between them parted like the sea before a god, leaving a clear path for the redhead to march up to the noble. Marcus was too wrapped up in his own anger to notice what was going on until Blake stood before him. Fear entered the man's eyes, and he tried to speak up once more, likely to beg like the coward he was. Blake didn't let the man do any such thing, planting his fist in the fat noble's gut. Marcus's lungs in a rush as he doubled over after the blow. The young man then grabbed the man by his hair and dragged him to the ground that had just moments before been a makeshift battleground. Marcus's knee was kicked and he was forced to kneel from the pain. Then, as he was about to look up at the one who had humiliated him, he found steel at his neck instead. You, Count Marcus, have been found guilty of slavery, cruelty, murder, and crimes against all forms of decency. As such, I, Blake Brightheart, sentence you to death for these crimes against your fellow men. Would any here object? Blake declared in a booming voice as he listed off the man's crimes, before posing the question to all those assembled. None spoke up, even had Marcus looked around and pleaded. He searched for mercy or sympathy, but found only disgust and hate in the crowd. The man's outburst had made all the rumors spreading all but confirmed to them all. Of how he was responsible for so much death, and the enslavement of their people. Of what he did to those he chained, and how he kept the citizens under his heel. No one spoke up a word in the man's defense, instead many looking as if they themselves wished to swing the sword. Very well then may whatever God you believe in have mercy upon you, Marcus. You will find none here in the land of the living left for you, Blake stated before raising his sword, and bringing down the blade on the man's neck. Blood pooled onto the ground and coated the blade Blake used. With a swipe to the side, the redhead threw the blood off his sword, not wanting the blood of such a man on his creation any longer than necessary. Taking a deep breath, Blake then decided to go on to the next part of the plan, and raised his sword to the sky as if declaring war on the heavens. People of Malstance, I have dispensed justice against this swine, but there are still many more like him. Many still claim the title of noble, of leader and protector that are unworthy of so. I ask you this. Do you wish to have them rule you? For they will fight for the empty throne just so they can find a higher perch to look down upon you from. Fiends worthy of your loyalty? He asked the crowd with fervor in his voice. For a moment, none spoke. Then Tristan spoke up as he stood from his place on the ground. No, they do not. Those that hold chains will never be fit to rule, or be worthy of anyone's, the now freedman shouted out, beginning to rally the rest with those words. Chants of no they don't, and other such sentiments poured from the crowd. Blake gave Tristan a smile and thanks before picking back up from where he left off. Then I ask you, the people who have been trampled upon. The people who have sweat and bleed for those undeserving. Will you join me? I am a man who was raised in a small village made from wood and dirt, knowing not to rely on any noble lord for help. I am one of you, one who was born in the dirt and seen as lesser than by those born in castles and bathed in. So will you follow me, a common man who has fought and bled for all he has into a brighter tomorrow? He shouted out for all to hear, and received a cheer in response. Blake Brightheart. Hail the new king. The chants poured in, the last coming from some men from Richard's squad as planned. The first person shouted for him to be king. It caught like wildfire, and soon all the assembled men, thousands if the volume was any indication, were declaring him king. It seemed the plan had worked, and now he just had to finish it up now. Then I swear here and now, with me as your king I shall serve the people. Not the nobles and the rich but the men and women, the sons and daughters that make up this land. Kings should serve the realm, that is my fervent belief. And I am nothing if not a man that shall live and die by my ideals. He declared for them all to hear, and the roar was deafening in response. And just like that, a king was born. Edited, February 27, 2026. Chapter End notes. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote, after you remove the spaces. Chapter 65, Chapter 60 Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Carrion sat on his throne, contemplating what all he knew was going on in the world as of. He'd recently gotten back from training his troops, his personal forces that he trained himself to ensure excellency. Now though he began to contemplate the reports he'd gotten on what happened to the nation of Malstans, more specifically how he might counter such an attack that decimates an entire army in less than a few minutes, like that was not something even the Beast King knew how to deal with. It made him wonder if he would have fared any better should he and his troops have been the target of such a man. In the end though his thoughts were interrupted by the rushing of one of his secretaries. Knew not to disturb him unless it was something of importance, so Carrion immediately straightened up on his golden throne. Soon enough the puma lycanthrope stood before him and bowed in subservience to her king. He motioned for her to rise and spoke his command. "Speak, what has made you rush here in such alarm? Not many can spook you like this after all," he said in his casual voice that carried a tilt of well-earned arrogance. "My king, Aaman has come here and issued a challenge to you." "A challenge to your position as demon lord," she told him, and stuttered out the first bit in her haste. Carrion regarded the words she delivered to him, and a smirk grew on his face. "And why has this challenger made such an impact on you?" "He certainly isn't the first to have come trying to usurp my position," the Beast King asked in a tone that showed neither worry nor insult at the information. For him this was nothing more than an interesting surprise, not having thought any would challenge him any more. Ever since becoming king of Eurasania, and soon after a demon lord, many had come to challenge him for either position. But after the first few countries of going undefeated, the challenges died down. It had been close to 50 years since any had dared to issue Carrion a challenge, so in a way he was looking forward to a potential battle. But the way his secretary was acting was odd to him. A simple challenge should not have elicited such a reaction from the woman. "My king, it is due to his aura. He let some of it leak from him when issuing the challenge, and I have not felt closer to death than in that moment," she told him, a slight look of shame crossing her face at her own perceived weakness. Carrion dropped his smirk then, truly at alert now at those words. While the puma woman before may be a simple secretary, now she was not weak nor inexperienced in combat, especially of the life and death variety. For she had fought in the last Tenma war alongside him, and while not having distinguished herself enough to join his personal army, she had shown promise. That was why she held the position she now had after all, for none that served him in even the most minor of ways could be weak. So for her to say such a thing was alarming to him. It meant that this man, whoever he was a possible threat to him. Once that thought fully registered in his mind, Carrion smiled. Maybe this one will prove interesting after all, he thought to himself before giving his orders to the woman. The woman Lucian asked to inform the king of his challenge came back with a slightly still pale expression on her face. She informed him that his challenge had been accepted and to follow her. Sharing a look with his companions, Lucian shrugged before doing just that. Puma woman then led them through the complex until they reached a courtyard of great size with a cleared-out circle of dirt in the center. It was there that Lucian got his first look at Carrion. Was dressed in the same garb he had worn in the anime, loose pants, and what looked like black toga that showed off half his chest. He had shaggy blonde hair that spoke to his wild nature, and red tribal-like tattoos could be seen, mainly in the form of a mark on his exposed pectoral. Standing next to him though were his 3 beastketeers. All of them looked as expected, from the more refined beauty of Albiz to the rugged, almost tomboyish Sophia, and the fierce-looking Phobio. "It seems you've brought out your top people for little ol' me, huh?" Lucian said at the sight in a slightly teasing manner, riling up the 3 beastketeers at his comment. Of course, that was on purpose. Lucian had intended to challenge the 3 as part of his plan from the very beginning, so riling them up only served to aid in that endeavor. He needed to prove his strength after all, and the Nephilim doubted there wouldn't be some kind of test for him before he could fight the king how he wished. Before any of the 3 could react though to his words, Carrion held up his hand to stop. It seemed he noticed the move for what it was, and looked at Lucian with slight amusement. Yes, after all, once I was told you brought your own entourage, it was only right I returned the regardless. I have heard that you wished to challenge me then, the Lion King said with a smirk on his face that showed his confidence in his own ability. Lucian regarded him more closely than before, smiling himself. Yes, though I wish to be more specific on the details of my challenge. I don't just want your position as Demon Lord, but as king of this nation, Lucian said, projecting his own confidence that made it clear that this was no jest. Carrion was taken back at the audacity of the men before him, and couldn't stop himself from "Is that so? And what makes you think you have the right to issue such a challenge?" The Beastmaster asked, more so wanting a glimpse into the man's thoughts and personality than denying the challenge. "I think I have the right because I have the strength to back it up. That is how it works here after all, right? But if you doubt my strength, I'm more than willing to prove it by easily defeating your 3 retainers over there." The silver-haired man responded with a careless shrug of his shoulders. That made the Beast King smirk once more before looking at his Beastketeers. Looked raring to go, like they couldn't wait to pulverize the men before him that showed so little respect. So he decided to humor the men before him. "Very well, if you can defeat all 3 of my Beastketeers, I'll fight you in earnest. Hell, I'll even let you decide the time and place if you can do that," he told him, full confidence in his. Lucian laughed inside his mind as he spoke his next words, the words that would ensure all was going according to plan. "Is that a deal then?" "It's a deal, Majin. Now why don't you tell me your name?" would be challenger. Agreed before finally asking the man his name. The silver-haired man had made his hair stand on end since laying eyes on him, danger coming from him in waves. The others hadn't seemed to notice like he had, but Carrion was. Sure, this man was strong. Whether or not he was strong enough to give him a real fight was up in the air, though still. Regardless of all that, just for the sure gall of this man, he wanted to know his name. "Lucian Silver is my name, Lord Carrion," the now named Lucian said with a theatrical bow. That spoke of sarcasm more than any words could. It amused him for a moment before the name registered in his mind. Carrion knew that name from the reports he'd been getting recently. In fact, this was the man who had defeated an entire army by himself, or at least claiming to be him. Though the Lionman doubted this man was lying about his name, something in his mind made him think such a thing was beneath the one before him. It didn't matter in the end. Phobio went into the sparring ring for the match before pointing directly at the man. "I'm going to make you regret looking down on us and being so disrespectful to Lord Carrion," the leopard man declared with an angry look on his face. Lucian walked casually into the ring, looking more like he was on a stroll than entering a that only served to piss off Phobio more, and so it was to no surprise that once Carrion gave the word to begin the match, the hot-headed lycanthrope charged at his opponent immediately. The one known as the Black Leopard Fong threw punch after punch, and kick after kick in a flurry of combo attacks. Sadly, none of them were landing as Lucian evaded each strike, with that alone would have been enough to enrage the black-haired man. It was the fact that Lucian was doing all this with his eyes closed that made it so infuriating to Phobio. Made the Beastketeer give up on holding back, and soon black flames come from his fists. The flames seemed to also make the lycanthrope move faster, fast enough it seemed that Lucian finally opened up his eyes. Still, though each attack was evaded and a solid few minutes passed like this, Phobio kept pushing and pushing, trying to land a solid blow but failing each time. He was exerting himself more than he'd done in a long time, barring the occasional spar against his fellow Beastketeers or his king. Eventually, though, an opening presented itself and he took it, not noticing the smile on his opponent's face when he did so. Finally a blow landed on Lucian, a fist of black flames meeting the smug man's face. However, Phobio wasn't able to celebrate for long as he noticed that Lucian hadn't moved a bit from the blow. Looking closely, he noticed that the silver-haired man wasn't even burned from the flames, instead looking completely fine. His shock must have been clear to see as Lucian chuckles before speaking. "Did you think your weak flames could burn me? Let me show you real fire," the man said with a smile that sent shivers down Phobio's spine and made him jump back. The added distance didn't help though, as a wave of blue flames came from his foe, bathing the sparring ring in fire. Phobio had nowhere to run and soon the flames overtook him. However, he didn't burn nor feel the pain of fire searing his flesh like he expected. At first he thought that meant this had been naught but a bluff, but then he noticed how tired he was getting. In a spark of realization Phobio put together what was happening to him. These flames were burning his very stamina, and it was working. Before he could say anything, Phobio collapsed in exhaustion, his last thoughts reflecting the truth of the situation he found himself. I didn't have a chance from the start, did I? He thought bitterly before falling to the ground, too tired to even stand or keep his eyes open. Gazel watched on as his council argued about what they should do, his thoughts elsewhere. He had gotten the reports like all those assembled here, about how the army of the nation of Malstance was annihilated in but less than an hour. Such strength alone would warrant this meeting. The fact that the one responsible was someone known to them and of interest to the king made it all the more so. Gazel had thought the man known as Lucian Silver would make himself known, but the manner in which he did it was quite the surprise. Many might think a hero king like himself would condemn the actions of the supposed. The truth was he was a man that knew war, and he knew the death that it brought. According to the casualty report his sources had given him, the death toll was surprisingly only a few thousand died after all, when normally war brought death in the hundreds of thousands. If not by the death of soldiers then by the deaths of civilians due to disease, famine, starvation and pillaging from armed men to support the war effort. These were all things he'd seen bring death to the land in his time as king, and in the records left by his predecessors. Dworgen had 1,000 years of history after all, and history was a story of blood one would find. Human history even more so, the short-lived race loving to kill each other, and make their short lives even shorter it seemed. At least, their leaders seemed to love doing so from what history showed. Recent events only lent more evidence to this fact. The others kept blathering on though, talking about what their response would be to this. Gazel felt it should be obvious and decided to say the answer to end this drivel. It is simple what our response is, nothing. Malstance was no friend of ours, not even any trade agreements having been made in over 200 years. That was several kings ago. For them, when last the line that held their throne had honor of any kind. According to the reports the king of Malstance, both former and last, were in the wrong. Furthermore, they used large amounts of slaves in their war. Slaves that were spared by Lucian Silver, some of which according to our information are dwarves that are likely citizens of our own nation, the dwarven king declared while gesturing to the packet before him that matched the ones before each of the others that held the information he spoke of. At the mention of the now freed slaves that were likely members of their own nation the advisors went silent. It was undeniable that such acts were abhorrent and deeply loathed by the king, not that any of them liked them either. The blatant endorsement of dwarven slavery would have been enough for them to consider declaring war on the nation of Malstance. Such there truly was no reason to send even false sympathies to the Council of the West for their member nation. Now, as for Lucian Silver himself, I have reached a decision. We will wait for him to reach out, and should we do so we will not meet it with violence. I wish to meet this man for myself and furthermore, I wish to determine his worth, King Gazel Dwargo said, and none there raised an objection to the order. It seemed their king had found someone of interest, and perhaps one that may aid them in the coming times. After all, not many make their king even consider testing their worth in the first place. Edited, March 2, 2026 Chapter End Notes. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote, after you remove the spaces. Chapter 66, Chapter 61 Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. After Phobio's defeat a small break happened where Sophia dragged his unconscious body out of the ring. Initially Lucian thought that they would maybe call a doctor or healer for the leopard man. Instead however the white tiger woman just slapped him across the face. "Wake up Phobio!" She yelled into his face and startled him awake with the combination of her voice and her biological percussive maintenance. The member of the Beastketeers woke up and looked around, soon putting together that Phobio slumped in defeat after that realization. Lucian was a bit surprised that the lycanthrope woke up so quickly, but not overly so. All he'd done was burn away enough of the man's stamina to make him pass out for a bit after all. He didn't want to cause any true harm to the Beastketeers. That was a good way of making them resent him. If all goes according to plan, they'll be my subordinates soon enough. Don't want to make them view me antagonistically if I can help it, at least not too much, the Nephilim thought to himself before speaking up. So, is it time for the next one of you all to come and test your mettle against mine yet? Lucian said with a smirk that the tiger woman growled at. Sophia then entered the ring and puffed out her chest. Confidence was still in her gait despite how handedly he handled Phobio. It made Lucian curious why she held such firm belief in her victory, a question that was soon answered. You talk a big game, but now that I know your trick with the flames, I'll bet you down. Besides, I'm stronger than Phobio, so I won't go down nearly as easily, she claimed while pointing to her own chest with her thumb in a bragging manner. Lucian just smirked at the boast from the woman, looking forward to proving her wrong. Two took their stances and soon the signal was given by the now awake Phobio to begin. Sophia instantly cloaked herself in electricity and tried to blitz Lucian. She threw a left jab followed by a spinning kick that the silver-haired man leaned back from to avoid. Nothing but air was a bit of a surprise to the lightning-fast fighter, but wasn't enough to put her off balance. Maintaining her momentum, she then transitioned into a savage backhand aimed for his face. Lucian decided to take a different approach with this fight, and caught her attack. He didn't let the surprise Sophia showed at the action pause the flow of the fight though, instead moving to attack with some jabs of his own. Initially they were about as fast as Phobio had been, which while certainly speedy, were not as fast as the lighting user. Gradually though Lucian sped up while incorporating more moves using his whole body. Jabs become feints for elbow strikes, his leg would kick out to attack her footing only for a rising knee to come for her chin the next moment. As the fight went on he kept getting faster and faster, soon matching her speed, and then exceeding it. Initially Sophia had easily been bobbing and weaving through the attacks, thinking maybe she could tire him out. However, she soon started needing to properly block and tank blows, her highly valued speed no longer enough to keep up. Sweat began to bead down her brow at the avalanche of attacks coming her way. It felt like she was being drowned in attacks, each one barely a moment apart from the next. It's like I'm fighting multiple people with how many attacks he's sending my way, thought to herself as the pressure kept up on her. Then, right when she felt she was about to be completely overwhelmed, Lucian disengaged. Sophia was so desperate for a breather she didn't even question the sudden decision. Back a few feet away from her opponent she took the time to catch her breath, eyes on her foe. All the while, Lucian though just kept smiling before saying something that made her blood. You did pretty good there. I think now I'll go a bit faster, try and keep up okay, he told her, ending the statement with a cheeky wink. Before Sophia could fully process the ramifications of those words, or get pissed off at the snark he gave, she was moving faster than ever before. The increase in speed though wasn't from any sudden power boost though, instead it was raw animal instinct telling her to coming to a stop. A yard away she looked at where she just previously stood only to see a small crater formed around her foe's fist. She gulped at that, aware that if she hadn't moved from pure survival instinct that would have definitely caused some major. Lucian laughed at the fact she dodged and decided to finish things now. Appearing right behind her almost instantly with the aid of some spatial manipulation, Lucian landed a blow to her mid-back. Sophia couldn't react and was launched full force out of the ring and into a nearby wall. Dust was kicked up from the impact, and after a little bit of waiting it cleared. Once cleared, Sophia's form could be seen embedded in the wall, eyes rolled back and head lolling to the side showing her current state of unconsciousness. Lucian wiped his hands on his dress shirt and gave Alice a look that she instantly understood. Walking up to the out-of-commission feline woman, the black-haired demon took out a potion from her storage. Splashing it onto the white-haired Beastketeer resulted in her wounds healing up nicely and her quick return to the waking world. Once she opened her eyes again, and saw her position, she knew she had lost. Not saying a word, Sophia walked back over to where her lord stood, head hung in defeat. Lucian in this time used some land domination that he copied from Surtur to smooth out the dirt arena once more. Once that was done and his most recent opponent was back among her comrades, he turned to the last remaining member of the Beastketeers. "So Albes the Golden Serpent, are you ready to face me next?" he asked, looking completely at ease, and like he had just had a pleasant stroll instead of a high-speed battle. The sight of this strange man she now had to fight made Albes wary. Just who is this man? She couldn't help but think before heading into the arena. Alex was glad to see everyone doing so well in the no longer small encampment. Ever since Emma had taken charge, things had been running far more smoothly, and they'd had far more time for their other duties. Things like compiling dossiers on various members of the remaining nobility and military leadership of Malstance being chief among them. Blackmail material to profiles detailing personality and loyalties to so much more were needed for each one. The fact that there were probably hundreds needed to be made before everything was said and done only made the task all the more time-consuming. These dossiers were meant to aid Blake and his allies in their efforts to take over the nation of Malstance, of course. Though they would also be very helpful in the aftermath to deal with any and all that would survive the subjugation. Other important figures were also being investigated and researched, such as merchants and high-ranking adventurers that called the nation home. All this was incredibly expansive in scope for Alex, and they were honestly loving it. They would have never been able to do all that they have been if Emma hadn't taken the management duties from them. Due to that, they'd even had some time to give for their own side project. This project was sending out some spare body doubles to search for different spider species, whether monster or otherwise. This was in hopes of finding and recruiting various spiders for familiars and for other potential uses. So far they'd been having little luck in the more monsterized spiders, but their collection of normal ones was slowly growing. Alex hoped to name them soon and see what might happen after bonding some more with them. That would all come in time though, and it was more so a long-term project for now in their mind. But that all was only what was going on with them. The camp had been plenty busy as well. Not only did Emma organize everything from living spaces to labor duties better than before, but she was also getting everyone prepped. This preparation was for the journey that they'd all need to take in time, for everyone knew this wasn't a permanent abode. Many of the monsters and Magian, as well as the humans and some demi-humans, wanted to go live in Lucian's territory once he had some. That would require them to travel quite a distance, and that meant supplies. Likewise, the others that wished to return back home, such as the dwarves from Dworgen, also needed to prep for their own journey. This resulted in many of the former craftsmen having their skills being put to use. Things like tents and travel bags, sturdier traveling clothes and carts for hauling. Others took charge of hunting and gathering food for the trips that would then be preserved by others. Smoked meat, jarred jams, and dried foods like jerky and fruit leather were being made en masse along with other foods with long shelf lives. There were so many people after all that simply foraging or buying food on the way was unfeasible. Not unless they were willing to let many of them starve at least. Furthermore, medicines were also produced for the travels ahead of them. Typically herbal remedies for common ailments. Things like upset stomachs and common diseases that could plague the less hardy members of the group were what they were meant to treat. Access to healing magic of any kind, only a few former combat and care slaves knew. Even the beyond all that there was the efforts of the others as well. Ivy was instrumental in making enough crops for everyone to eat and prepare. More than that though, she also grew many of the medicinal herbs being used and even taught a few basic remedies to freedmen. Apparently she knew a thing or two about such practices from her time studying biology and her knowledge of plants. Alex found it quite interesting how much the red-headed nymph knew about all those things. The fact that she'd shared a few poison recipes with them was also something that Alex felt very appreciative of. After all, a strong laxative in an enemy's water supply could end a battle before it even began. Harley meanwhile had been doing her best to help those who suffered great trauma. To some that had been rescued were in states of mental degradation, some even in an almost catatonic state from all that they'd been through. Some others were prone to violent outburst or sudden breakdowns, whether from PTSD or other afflictions. The former psychiatrist did her best to help them, and several had started adopting healthy coping mechanisms with her help. However, everyone knew that it was a long battle to come in order to help everyone work through everything, and she was but one woman. Historia meanwhile not only helped Ivy with her gardening endeavors, but helped out with the children in the camp. Her childlike form and personality made it easier for her to connect with the many orphans and other children. This combined with her ability to make scouts for danger made her very good at keeping an eye on all the kids while still being able to alert anyone about anything that may arise that needed to be handled. This was a massive help to say the least, and one that many of the few parents who still had their children not be separated from them during their enslavement were quite grateful for. Overall, Alex felt things were on the up and up. It brought a smile to their face at the thought. Glad that these people they'd helped save were getting back on their feet. It made them feel good inside, like it was something they could be proud of that didn't deal with their skill in espionage. Because while they loved gathering information and being their sire's spymaster, it was nice to know that they were more than that. Now, just to wait for Sire to finish up in Eurasania, and take his rightful place as a demon then, the real work begins, Alex thought to themselves before going back to gathering information. It seemed like some stirrings from the Council of the West were deserving of more investigation after all. Alex would not let them keep their secrets from them, not when they posed a potential threat. For they were the eyes in the darkness, and they saw all that those who went against their family tried to keep from the light. Them and their little friends. That edited, March 6, 2026. Chapter End Notes. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote after you remove the spaces. Chapter 67, Chapter 62. Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Albiz stood opposite her opponent and considered what she could do in the face of this man. Quickly she decided to enter her beast form before the battle even began, her lower half elongating and transforming into the body of a large serpent. As a golden horn grew from her, she stretched out her new form, and readied herself for the bout that was to. Strategies flooded her mind, and were discarded just as quickly. Before she could put together a full plan, her lord spoke up. "Let the fight commence," Carrion announced while lowering his raised hand. Albiz reacted on instinct and dodged out of the way of Lucian's punch. It hit the ground where she previously was and left a crater, a common occurrence it seemed in the fights against the men. Albiz sweated as she realized that he was moving slower than in his fight against Sophia, at least in the final moments of that fight. And yet she was still almost taken off guard. The Serpent Lady knew though what that was though, a probing attack to gauge her reaction time. She wasn't a speed-based fighter like her White Tiger companion, nor a brawler like Phobio. Truth, she specialized in long-range attacks and status effects, with her staff serving as both a magical conduit and close-range weapon both. Something told her though that fighting close range was not the way to go against this man though, the previous fights making that all the more certain in her eyes. Thus she decided to merge with her staff from the beginning in order to utilize its power more deftly for her long-range abilities. I might just have a chance as long as I keep my distance, she thought to herself, and slithered. Lucian stood there, seemingly waiting for her to make the next move, and holding no true wariness for her. It would piss her off if she didn't understand why he was acting this way. For the foes he'd faced had not been challenging in the slightest, so why should she be any different? That was likely his thought process, she felt. Albiz decided to take advantage of the added time though, and as she planned her approach activated her unique skill suppressor. That would prevent him from using any spatial movement to catch her off guard, or any other spatial abilities he might possess. All this happened in but a few seconds at most, thought acceleration allowing Albiz to plan everything out and execute it quickly even mid-battle. Then she activated Snake Eye to try and inflict paralysis on Lucian, as she channeled her purple lighting into her palm. seemed to straighten, seemingly stunned by the status effect, though Albise was under no illusion that it would last long against such a strong foe. So she took this opportunity, not willing to waste it in the slightest, and discharged her lighting directly at him. The purple lighting struck him, and she heard him grunt in pain before the paralysis wore off. Sounds of pain came from the illuminated pillar of purple electricity, yet she felt uneasy. Feeling was soon proven right. It hurts us. Just kidding. Lucian's sounds of pain soon turned to laughter, and the lightning died a swift death, leaving his untouched form in clear. Albise was surprised despite herself. The sight of her attack doing absolutely nothing was demoralizing in the extreme. As he began walking towards her, though, Albise panicked a bit, and began trying to bombard him with every status effect in her arsenal, only to no avail. Lucian was then in front of her, looking for all the world like he just took a pleasant stroll. Then leaned close to her and spoke into her ear, not whispering at all despite this, as if to show he didn't care who heard him. "I forgot to mention, I'm immune to status effects and weak magic like that little snake," he told her with a grin of satisfaction on his face at those words. It was then that Albise knew that this battle had been destined for only one outcome from the start, their defeat. This man was stronger than Phobio, faster than Sophia, and immune to everything Albise could throw his way. Once that realization hit her, the serpent lycanthrope felt demoralized more than ever before, and the will to fight seemed to leave her. Seeing this, just picked her up and placed her outside of the ring, a final showcase of just how much stronger he was than all of them. Albise wondered what was going on in this man's head at this moment, having just trounced the 3 Biscuiteers with ease. "I always wanted to do that. Protagonist move for the win," Lucian thought in his mind, excited to pull off an anime move like that. During the fight, Lucian had gone over what he knew of Albise's abilities, and quickly realized that her entire skill set was useless against him. It then made him remember the scenes from the anime where Rimuru, or the Orc Lord, pretended to be hurt by someone's special attack only to show they were perfectly fine instead. The Nephilim's nerd brain couldn't pass up the opportunity to pull something similar, and that led to him ending the battle how he did. He did feel a bit bad for essentially disrespecting Albise so badly with what he did. Hoped that this would only serve as motivation for her to get stronger. After all, despite her being the leader of the Biscuiteers, she was the weakest right now in his mind. The majority of her skill set was pointless against anyone with abnormal condition nullification, and all of the truly powerful had that or something that achieved the same results. Debuff mages are dealt pretty dirty in this universe, huh? Lucian contemplated in his mind before turning to Carrion. The Beastmaster looked stoic all told, and if not for the slight look of apprehension in his eyes, Lucian would think the man unbothered. But with his senses, it made even the smallest change physically apparent to him. The Nephilim walked over to the king, and stared into his eyes for a moment, neither saying a word. Lucian broke the silence in the end. "A few moments, it appears that I have won this challenge, Lord Carrion," he said with a grin still on his face. Carrion looked at him then and seemed to pause for a moment before responding. "It would appear so. Then, in accordance with what was agreed on, you may pick the time and place of our battle," the Lionman responded, voice gruff, and not betraying the nerves he now felt at the coming battle. What Lucian would respond with only made him all the more nervous. "Good, then I chose Walpurgis to be the place of our battle. I have the 2 other votes to add to yours in order to call it, so don't worry about that. Instead, focus on the coming battle between us that will take place in front of all the demon lords," Lucian told him, almost seeming to dare the man to refuse his choice in venue. Carrion could do nothing but stiffly nod at the order, for that was what it was in truth. Lycanthrope's pride bristled, but he knew better than to disagree in this instance. Longer a question in his mind that the man before him was the same man who had toppled the army of Malstance. And if the reports were to be believed, going back on his word would do him no favors, even if his own honor didn't demand he follow through. After that was agreed on, Carrion offered accommodation in the visitor wing for Lucian and his companions to stay in until the battle. Lucian agreed and told him that he'd reach out to the other demon lord he knew to tell them of their deal, that way they could get the necessary votes to call Walpurgis. Carrion didn't even question how he would do such a thing. the strength on display making it clear that Lucian was holding much back in terms of his capabilities. Lucian and co. were then shown to their quarters by an attendant that was called. Were well furnished even though it was clear that they didn't see much use. Each member of the party got their own room, each coming equipped with a four-poster bed and various accompanying furniture such as an armoire and a desk made out of wood. It was a nice change of pace from the camping they had done on the way here, Lucian felt. From the look of relief on Kushina's face, and the less pronounced one on Alice's, it seemed that the others appreciated the change as well. Surtur and Alfred seemed like they could care less about whether or not they slept on a bed or the ground. They did seem pretty happy when their guiding attendant told them of the training grounds during the walk to the rooms, however. The two muscleheads were looking forward to stretching their muscles, it seemed. Or perhaps they just thought it had been too long since they got their knuckles bloody, so to speak. Lucian wouldn't be surprised either way with those two. A few hours later, after everyone was set up, they all met up in the room Lucian was given. Once they all gathered, they looked to him, waiting for the next course of action. Smiled at them all, happy to see them have so much trust in him that they seemed ready to accept whatever plan he put forth. He knew that for Alice and Alfred it was mostly from true faith, while Surtur was due to the loyalty the fire giant held for him. Kushina meanwhile more so had faith in his strength, knowing that next to any plan was likely to succeed with his strength and knowledge. The former Kunoichi had confided in him that she saw him a bit like she had her village leader, the Hokage, strong enough to deserve faith be given to him, and his it certainly made things easier for him in the long run, Lucian felt. Thus he also had great faith in them all in return. Enough for him to be comfortable in his next actions. All right, everything is going according to plan so far. As such, I am going to go and speak with the Elemental Queen, and complete our bargain and finalize her support for Walpurgis. So I will be teleporting to the dwelling of spirits in the morning to converse with her. You all to be careful and considerate while I'm gone. I will soon be ruling this place, and I'd prefer to not be the king of rubble and ashes. He told them all the plan, his last words making both Alfred and Surtur look away bashfully. The two knew that last bit was said in regard to them, their past exploits making that obvious. Alice snickered a bit at her brother's plight of being seen as the problem child, so to speak. Kushina also felt it was quite the humorous sight to see someone like Surtur, someone who could rival a Biju in destructive ability, look like a child being scolded for sneaking into the cookie jar. In the end, though, they all nodded and accepted the plan as it was laid out before them. Each were looking forward to this whole thing being done and over with. For their leader to take his rightful place on the world stage, and for them to finally have a place to call their. They all also knew that their lord had plans for the future, preparations for the wars. Lucian intended to win the war that was coming their way, and to win it in the most complete way imaginable. For there was only about a decade at most until it began, and he wanted to waste no more time now that he had achieved the power of a demon lord. It was only the lack of the title that was truly holding him back, something that would soon be rectified, they all knew. Blake looked out at the assembled army before him, the bustling camp, a sight that he had never thought to be possible as a boy. Especially since they all were now under his command of their own accord. After executing Count Marcus and rallying the soldiers that remained, much had happened. 3 days had passed, and now he had a command tent that he met squadron leaders in, and held meetings with his inner circle late into the night. Within the tent was a large table that had a map of the country on it with scribbled markings from them planning their march and plan of attack. During this time Blake had ordered a surveying of their forces and supplies, and only recently received the report from one of the few literate men in his army. All told, he now had a little over 7,000 men under his command, though that number was likely to grow according to Lord Noctis. This was due to the men informing him that he himself had a good amount of troops in reserve back in his territory, and some of the nobles he was friendly with, the scant few that they were, had some as well. These men were highly likely to join up, and that combined with the need for more supplies made the destination all but decided. They were heading towards the north where Lord Noctis's domain was, and planned on stopping by at each holdfast and noble's territory on the way there. This would let them pick up more men, and more importantly more supplies. The report told Blake that they had only enough supplies for a month-long march roughly, not nearly enough to last the whole campaign that was ahead of them he knew. It would take more than a month to even march to the capital with an army this size after all, not being helped at all by the fact that maybe only 100 or 2 had horses to mount. The logistics were crushing to say the least, so Blake was all the more glad to have Noctis help him and give him a potential, otherwise the Redhead's men were likely to die from starvation and fatigue rather than by sword or bow. It had been something Lucian warned him of as well, and was something that he had offered Blake help with should the need arise. Likely after his brother took over Eurasania, he would be taking him up on that offer. There were simply too many mouths to feed, it seemed long-term, and hunting and gathering their food would only be as effective as bandage on a gaping wound. Blake sighed, though a smile never left his face. He may be young, but with the aid of his inner circle and family, as well as his own growing instincts, he felt all would be fine, and his mind though went elsewhere from the large scale of the war ahead of him to something more personal. Specifically something that was going on with his unique skill, heroic inspiration. The last subskill that had eluded him had finally become apparent to him after so many had sworn themselves to him. The ability was called Ruler's Strength, and it increased his physical and magical abilities. Under certain conditions based on the amount of people who willingly chose to follow him. The conditions were he had to be fighting for something that he strongly believed in, and it could not be used against anyone who was loyal to him. Both those conditions felt like no problem at all for him, but Blake did understand the possible restrictions of this. Such as if he truly didn't believe in the cause he was fighting for but needed to fight anyway, the boost would not apply. It also was unlikely to apply to any fight where he didn't wish to kill his that could also pose issues in more friendly situations. In essence, it was a boost given to him for fights where he needed to give it his all. Right now, should he activate the ability, he felt his power would increase roughly 7-fold. With that in mind, it seemed that for roughly every 1,000 people that chose to follow him, the multiplier went up by 1. Blake also deduced that the strength of the individual also impacted this to a certain extent, and those that viewed themselves as his equal didn't count. So Lucian and the others didn't count. As well, anyone whose loyalty to another leader outweighed their loyalty to him would count for less. Like if someone was more loyal to their local lord than to him, it would be less effective. The skill was quite complicated, and he felt there were still nuances to it all that he had yet to discover. Then, to compound all this, Blake could tell that using this boost will be incredibly taxing on physically, mentally, magically and spiritually. It would exhaust him after likely no more than 5 minutes of use in his current state. Blake honestly felt that anyone below an incomplete saint like himself tried to use it, they'd likely die from the strain. It made sense. Though once the Redhead realized the mechanic by which it worked, and only after remembering a conversation with Lucian about magic. From what he could tell, this new ability of his worked on a similar principle as holy magic in the way it converted belief in him into power. Lucian and Alice had theorized that the strain of being the god for a system of holy magic was incredibly taxing and likely only possible for one with divinity to do safely. Blake did not possess divinity, yet his skill allowed him to borrow aspects from the foundations of holy magic regardless. Likely the reason for the strain it put on him when used, a rebound effect for someone still mortal using a power akin to that of the divine. In the end though, it's just another reason to get stronger. That way I can eventually use the strength my people are giving me without limit, and protect them should the need arise, he said to himself before heading back into his tent. Blake intended to get some rest now, for he would need it. After all, they marched at dawn tomorrow, and he would need all the energy he could get both mentally and physically for the coming days. He had a crown to forge, and it was by his hands it would manifest. Edited, March 9, 2026. Chapter and notes. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote, after you remove the spaces. Chapter 68, Chapter 63. Chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. This sucks. Phobio exclaimed as he punched a hole into the stone wall in frustration. Carrion and the other Beastketeers watched on without saying anything, in part due to the fact that they all somewhat agreed with him. Phobio was just the only one hot-headed enough to vocalize it like he was. Albise was more melancholic about the situation, feeling useless after having her specialty be completely negated by Lucian without him even trying. Personally took a good blow to her pride from how thoroughly she was outsped, something she thought only someone like Lord Carrion, or the other demon lords would be capable of. Not some Magian that came out of the blue like he did. Carrion clocked all this, noting the state of his chief subordinates. He didn't offer them any words of comfort, and not only because he didn't have any for them. He knew they wouldn't want any anyway. Instead he was replaying the fights he'd bore witness to in his mind, analyzing every movement and every blow. In the end, he came to only one conclusion that he couldn't stop himself from uttering out loud. He was holding back. Carrion murmured, less a theory or realization, but the stating of a fact that he felt in his bones to be true. Carrion was a massively experienced fighter, and knew combat better than most in this world. He'd spent more time on the battlefield and training than an entire human's lifespan after all, and all that experience made him understand the truth. Lucian was holding back, and by a lot looking to his Beastketeers he saw not one of them look surprised at the words they may not be as skilled as their king, but they could tell that the gap in power between them and Lucian was like the distance between heaven and earth. Phobio looked once more at his fist, and then the hole he put in the wall. He knew it was childish and immature to vent his frustration like this, especially in front of his lord. Couldn't help himself really. In a way he'd done it more to see if he still possessed enough strength to damage the wall. A way to confirm that he wasn't weak, but that the man who'd beaten them all was just that much stronger. It was a small comfort, and one that burned more than it soothed to be honest. In the end it was Albise who broke the ensuing silence. "My lord, I mean this with all due respect, but I must ask." The leader of the Beastketeers, and in the eyes of many the Beast King's right hand, began to ask the question they all wished. Carrion turned to her as she trailed off her sentence. He knew what she wished to ask and nodded at her, letting her know to go on and finish the question. "Can you win against that?" she asked, her choice of address coming from the fact that Albise struggled to think of someone so strong as a mere man. Carrion didn't answer right away, something that had never happened before when asked such a question. For good or ill their king was never unconfident in his own victory. It was the pride of a lion, the pride of a king, that made it an impossibility in his mind for him to lose. For the first time in centuries though doubt came to him that he wasn't able to shake off right. In the end though he shook himself off and responded with a grin to his subordinates. "Of course I'll win, I'm Carrion the Beastmaster, and I won't lose so easily," he told them all, a grin brimming with all the confidence he could muster. The three Beastketeers nodded along, wishing to believe their lord. But all of them noticed the wavering in his smile even if they didn't say anything. In truth, they all were wary as something they all saw as impossible was potentially coming, their Lion King, losing to another. Lucian wasted no time after speaking with his group, and used spatial movement the next morning bright and early. With a flash of light he found himself in front of what he knew to be the entrance to the dwelling of spirits. Letting out a breath of satisfaction at how well things were going, the Nephilim walked through the doors, and found himself transported once more, this time not from his own doing. Once the light faded from his eyes for a second time, he was greeted by a bit of an odd sight. Namely, an upside-down floating Ramiris that now looked to be about as big as an 8-year for some reason. She seemed to have a look of concentration on her face that instantly fell apart once she seemed to notice his presence. "What are you doing here?" she shouted out as she fell to the ground, her focus on floating broken. Lucian couldn't help but chuckle at the comical sight before him, finding the whole thing bewilderingly funny. After collecting himself from his laughter he managed to speak once more, and asked the fairy a question. What was that? And what do you mean, what am I doing here?" "You teleported me here directly instead of the entrance like before, so I thought you were expecting me," he asked her, still finding the face the blonde pixie made all too funny. Ramiris looked at him with a bit of a pout, her latest incarnation's more immature personality still the most prominent, and that fact showing in her actions. She crossed her arms and kicked the ground after that, embarrassed at Lucian finding her like that. In the end though she collected herself once more and answered her visitor. For your information, I was in the middle of meditating in hopes of getting back more of my power and memories. Sorting through the past few thousand years has been a nightmare. Just so happens that being upside down helps me think too. She told him, acting and looking like a child trying to scold an adult as she poked him with her right index finger with every other word. Lucian held his hands up in surrender, and did his best to stifle his reinvigorated laughter. All right then Ramiris, I get it. But why were you so surprised to see me pop up here instead of the entrance? Only you could have set something like that up to happen after all, he responded to her poking, and asked his second question. Ramiris then started to blush a bit, and poke her fingers together. It didn't take long for the Nephilim to put together what happened after seeing that reaction. She forgot, didn't she? He thought with a sweat drop going down his face like an anime character. If he needed any more proof that awakening Ramiris's memories and original personality wasn't finished yet, then this was all he needed. From what he remembered the fairy telling him, she herself admitted that her personality was quite different than before, with some core traits still being similar. As she'd described it, her original personality was far more mature in many regards and also quite a bit wiser. Though she also described her past self as quite stuffy in some regards, having lived since the dawn of time, and having to govern an important aspect of the world made her a bit more serious, it seemed. That part of her old self showed up from time to time according to what Blake had told him. Apparently she had gained the ability to act like a true queen again when commanding some of the elementals, at least from the scant few meetings Blake had borne witness to while training in the fairy's abode. In the end though, Lucian decided to just let things be and move on. As such he decided to get right to the point. Ramiris, I've come to complete our deal, he told her suddenly after the awkward silence had taken its course. She turned her head to him swiftly at those words and his serious voice. Her eyes met his and her demeanor changed in nearly an instant. Weight was now behind her more than he'd ever expected from the elemental queen. It was then he understood what Blake meant, and he couldn't help but be happy to see it. Very well then, I sense that you were stronger than before. Now that you've ascended and became a true demon lord, you should have no problem giving me a name. If you had waited about a year though, that would have no longer been true, at least not without great risk to yourself, Ramiris informed him, speaking in a manner that made him know she was serious in her assessment. In his mind Lucian couldn't help but sigh in relief, glad that his decision to only take 3 months to prepare for his accent was the correct one. The timetable was always something he'd been concerned over, wondering if he was taking things too fast or too slow. So far, and with this new evidence even more so, it seemed he was right on track with his timetable. Then it's good then that the wait is over. As such, I Lucian Silver grant you the name Ramiris Titania. For you are the fairy queen, he spoke to her and the world in that moment. Words heavy with weight. The reborn man felt the largest pull on his magicules he'd ever felt to date, roughly 90% from what he could tell. It terrified him and excited him in equal measure, the power that came forth from him in order to name the one before him. A glowing cocoon of power surrounded Ramiris then, and for a second that felt like an eternity she stayed in there. With a burst of energy the glowing expanded and bathed everything in the chamber they were in light. Once the light was gone, all that remained in front of him was a tall woman with flowing blonde hair. She looked regal and was almost as tall as himself, a sense of innate grace coming from her that he hadn't ever seen before. It was like looking at a star, he felt, a magnificent creation of the universe that was made by forces far beyond mortal understanding. The part that made it all the more exhilarating was the fact that he could tell, somehow, someway, that she still had the ability to grow further. The new form of Ramiris floated down, and regarded him with a calm look on her face. Looked untouchable, unassailable, unstoppable. Yet she smiled at him with such friendly affection he couldn't help but smile back at her. Then, in a voice smooth as silk she spoke. "Thank you, Lucian Silver, for aiding me so. I swear upon my new name Ramiris Titania, and upon my title of Queen of the Elementals that I shall repay this kindness," she told him, sincerity shining through her words in a way that almost seemed to burn away lies with how heavy it was with her true feelings. "But I just upheld my end of the deal. Nothing more, nothing less." Lucian tried to assure her that he required nothing more than what had been agreed upon, but was cut off by a tinkling. "You really don't have any idea how major a feat you have helped come to fruition, do you?" She asked him in a way that he knew meant she didn't truly expect a response. Lucian didn't know what she meant by that and could only shake his head no in response. Giggled again in that airy way she had taken on before responding again. "You will in time, O Lord of Balance," the newly awakened Ramiris thought to herself, excited for what was to come. For she could tell now that most of her power was back. This man before would change the edited, March 13, 2026 chapter and notes. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote, after you remove the spaces. Chapter 69, Chapter 60 for chapter notes A/N. I'm only adding this bit since many have made comments about this, and I thought it best to clarify ahead of time. Lucian will not be receiving a hero's egg in this story. Hope that this doesn't lessen anyone's enjoyment of this story, but that is firmly not going to happen. See the end of the chapter for more notes. After Ramiris assumed her new form, after being named, Lucian filled her in on all that had, when he got to the part about absolutely destroying the Beasketeers in the exhibition. She giggled a bit behind a dainty hand like some form of old nobility. Strangely, at least from his point of view, the act didn't feel like something forced or learned. Anything, it felt natural for her to laugh like that. It was as if the more dignified act was done merely because that was always how she did it, not that she did it because it was considered more dignified. It was just another change in her that showed off why she had the title of Queen, in the first place. Once he finished the recounting of all that had happened, Ramiris giggled a bit more before. "Oh, you truly shattered those three's confidence, didn't you? Lycanthropes are oh so proud of their strength, and you just showed them that it was nothing in the face of the true powers of this world." How cruel, she teased him over his actions, and Lucian couldn't help but blush a little at the teasing. The dichotomy of how she acted compared to before was quite startling to him, and he couldn't help but comment on it. "So this is your original personality then, Ramiris? Not sure if I can handle too much of it if you keep teasing me." He trailed off in the end, having never felt this way from another's actions and words before. For the first time he truly felt like a child before someone far older and more experienced in the ways of the world. In some ways it felt like how he imagined talking to the Elven Empress would feel like. It was with these thoughts that he truly began to understand what a difference age could play in these interactions. Even when talking with Kaijin and Shizu, he didn't feel this, even though they were both older than him, the former by likely centuries and the latter by a few decades. The one before him though was far older than him though, to the point that numbers become functionally meaningless in order to describe it. She was around when the world was yet young after all, and he'd yet to live even as long as the most minor of nations in this world. It was a bit of a humbling experience, Lucian felt, something he was glad to have now instead of later against someone far more antagonistic. For he knew there were monsters out in this world that could contend with Ramiris in both age and experience, and not all of them were monsters by race. "Ah yes, I suppose this change in demeanor would be a bit of a surprise to you." In essence, the answer to your question is both yes and no. I may have access to the majority of my memories now, including my original ones, but that also means that my personality is now being influenced by all of my memories. Over 2,000 years have passed since the start of my cycle of reincarnation, and that amount of memories would cause a change in anyone. The fact that several of those memories belong to what could be considered entirely different people even more so, she explained in a calm and teaching manner, almost motherly in a way that was somehow both unexpected and not. Lucian considered this and felt it made a large amount of sense. It was something he intellectually knew to likely be the case, but to see it right in front of him, and to happen so quickly was another thing entirely. The Elemental Queen wasn't done, however. But I should tell you that I am more similar to a mix of the Ramiris you knew before and the original one than any other. It seems that my latest incarnation has taken a bit of precedence over the others despite being around for the least amount of time. For instance, I still feel the wound of loneliness that has plagued me these past decades, before meeting you and your brother slowly healing despite such a thing not truly bothering my original self. It is quite odd. In a way, as if I have regained the emotions that my original self had muted over millennia of floating alone in the elemental realm, Ramiris told him, a hand on her chin, as if reflecting and analyzing her own mind and feelings as she talked. Something she said made Lucian curious though, and he asked about it, not seeing a reason to hold back since she was being so forthcoming. What do you mean floating alone in the elemental realm? He asked, honestly intrigued by the statement and its phrasing. The queen hummed to herself at that, as if weighing how best to explain. She then snapped her fingers and had a small grin on her face that reminded him of the small fairy he'd originally met, and made him grin in return. It's like this, just as there is a demon realm there is also an elemental realm. This realm, as the name implies, is the home and origin for elementals, most of the time anyway. Realm is connected to the cardinal world primarily through my labyrinth, as it is under my authority to open one wherever I want. It just so happens that I have lacked the power to sustain more than one for the past 2,000 years or so. However, this connection didn't always exist since Veldanava wanted to work on this world without the interference of my realm until it was complete enough, she told him, and took a breath to continue. Lucian was paying rapt attention, for this was information about the time of creation, and could be nothing if not valuable. So, naturally this took some time. But I have existed since the dawn of time bar a few minutes at most. As such, I existed in the elemental realm with egoless elemental energies for thousands of years if not more. Time was a bit hard to keep track of back then. This lasted until Veldanava allowed for the neighboring realms of the cardinal world, the demon realm and the elemental realm, to interact with it. Once that occurred I was able to form the first connections like my role is supposed to, and finally came to the physical world. Should about sum it up, I feel, she finished, her final words punctuated with a shrug. Lucian made sure to note all this down in his head for future reference. He didn't know when exactly it would be useful, but having such insights into the time of creation would be useful for something he knew. He felt it in his bones. For a little while after that there was silence between the two of them. Eventually though, Ramiris broke the silence. So you're calling Walpurgis just like you said, huh? Well, you'll have my vote, don't you? I also have a favor I can call in to get your third just like I said. You can tell Carrion that he can throw in his vote now, she told him with a serene smile on her face. Lucian nodded at that and almost teleported away before remembering he needed to ask a final question. Who should I tell Carrion the other demon lord is that will vote with him? I imagine he should know that at least, he asked the queen, and suddenly her simile turned mischievous. Oh, no one important. Just Malim Nava. See you soon, Lucian, she told him, not at all caring that the Nephilim looked like a deer in headlights as she forcefully finished his teleportation with but a wave of her hand. Lucian then reappeared in his room in Eurazania, and simply stared at the wall in shock, both from what the blonde had said, and what she had done. His companions seemed to have felt his return and soon came to his room, finding him still staring off into space. They started to get worried until he finally uttered with a quiet breath the words he felt from the depths of his soul in that moment. What the fuck, Ramiris? Ramiris giggles to herself for a moment, remembering the look on the Nephilim's face, before he disappeared in a glow of spatial magic. She quickly thanked the lesser elementals of space that answered her call to force his teleportation spell. Naturally she knew they couldn't truly understand her thanks, but what queen didn't show kindness to her subjects? Not her, for she held herself to a higher standard than those human rulers that tried to claim the same title as her. Besides, while the little ones may not fully understand, they could still sense the positive emotions she sent their way, and they seemed to wiggle in happiness at it. That alone was reason enough, she felt. After getting named, returning to almost her full power. Ramirez had regained her proper connection to the elementals. It was a slow-going process, like needing to relearn an old and mostly forgotten skill in many ways. But the bond she held with them all was coming back bit by bit, and it was plenty strong enough to let her call upon lesser elementals like this. Clenched her hand a few times, getting used to her form once more with a sense of awe. I never thought I'd truly regain this form, not for more than a fleeting instant when my incarnations pushed themselves at least. Those short bursts were never enough though to truly regain everything I am. Even now it should take me close to a year to fully reattune myself to everything, not to mention the likely mountain of work the elemental realm will have waiting for me after my protracted absence. She hung her head at that last bit, not at all looking forward to the headache putting her realm back in order would be. The elemental realm was her kingdom, or queendom if one were to be specific. As such she was the one and only ruler they had, and that meant that the leadership had been lacking these past 2,000 or so years. Only a few of her incarnations both lasted long enough, and had the desire to take up the mantle of leadership in all this time. So she had some memories of the state of things, albeit a few centuries out of date. Those memories didn't paint a pleasant picture. But that's all future Ramirez problems. I need to regain my full strength anyway. That's it. It's not just me pushing it off because I don't want to deal with it. Right, little guy? She tried to convince herself that she wasn't just procrastinating just as much as she was trying to convince the little lesser elementals around her. Sadly, they all seemed as close to embarrassed as they could get with their limited intelligence, something only her strong connection with them let her sense. Their reaction, if it could be called that, made her pout a bit and kick her feet against the air from her floating. Traitors, the lot of you. She grumbled to herself before getting serious once more. She searched her memories then for the exact location of where Malim's domain was. More specifically, she searched for where the dragonoid called home. The little firecracker hadn't changed layers in the past 1,000 years from what she remembered, so it was likely. The pink terror was still there. Soon enough Ramirez had the coordinates and focused on her connection to space in order to get there, one thought on her mind. I bet you never thought I'd even remember that you owed me, little princess. Well, it's time I collect, and if I get to prank you a little we'll just call that karma, she thought with a grin. Remembering all the pranks the little hellion pulled on her over the many years, and looking forward to getting some payback. With a flash of blue light the elemental queen vanished, off to see the one and only destroyer. Blake studied the lines before him from his position on horseback. Looking over the siege line and siege engines, he nodded to himself, satisfied with their positioning. He then looked to the walls of the keep itself, 20 feet tall, and made of stone over 6 feet thick, at the least according to the records the local townsfolk gave them. It was his army's first siege, and he was doing all he could to make this one the first of many victories. Not just for vanity, mind you, but also because he knew a loss this early in the campaign would be disastrous for the morale of the troops. Luckily it didn't seem like that would come to be, instead victory looked quite certain. In fact, he could say this even though the siege hadn't lasted but 3 days due to a variety of factors, chief among them being the stupidity of his foes' ancestors. For this house of nobles, the Mastiff House according to Noctis, had made a great blunder. That blunder being that despite being directly in charge of one of the few cities of the nation of Malstance, they insisted on living so far apart from the city. The fortification he was currently laying siege to was over 2 miles away from the city itself. Yet having relied on the city's infrastructure for food and goods, it was ridiculous, especially so since the nearest village was over 10 miles further out than the city. That meant that if someone took the city, the whole castle-like estate was without any form of supply chain. Now the whole castle was surviving on their stores alone, something that was limited by the fact that the family had decided to use most of their space for things like ballrooms instead of according to the civilians that lived in the city that used to work for the Mastiffs. The stores could hold maybe a month's worth of supplies at best. This, however, didn't mean that Blake needed to waste a whole month waiting them out, for not only did the family choose such a terrible place for their home, but their treatment of the common people of the city was also abysmal. So when Blake led his troops into the city and told them of his aims, he was met with open arms and welcoming accommodations. Apparently the tales of him fighting for them in the troll conflict had spread, and was seen as quite the tale among the common people, his simple background making it all the more easy for the story to resonate with them. Richard and his men had apparently not been quiet in their recanting of the conflict, as this had resulted in the story spreading to other soldiers, and according to the young commander, soldiers gossiped just as much if not more so than a drunk barmaid. Whatever that, Blake took it to mean that the soldiers were quite talkative, and thus spread the story all through the nation as they traveled on the march to and from different posts in the 3 months that had taken place since the conflict. The massive amount of movement in preparation for the battle against Lucian only sped up the process. In the end, though, it meant more of the common people were willing to listen to him when Blake spoke of his goals. This had resulted in many of them coming to him and offering help. Some had been lying, something that he could clock now with his enhanced senses making most normal people an open book to him now. He'd accepted them into the ranks anyway, just with some orders to those in command to keep an eye on them for now. Blake hoped that spending time with the men and seeing his actions would change their minds and have them truly believe in him. Besides, the majority only lied about believing in the cause and did not harbor any ill intent. They just couldn't truly trust that someone was trying to make their lives others, though didn't volunteer to be soldiers in his army, and instead offered other things. This ranged from supplies to maps to something that made this siege a foregone conclusion: information. Many of the former workers of the castle had come to his men and offered insight into the fortifications they faced. Chief among these bits of information were talks of secret passages that some had found during their time working there. Some of these passages seemed long forgotten, disrepair showing their lack of use. Naturally, Blake had ordered some men to confirm these reports, and thankfully they proved now they had a backdoor into the castle, something that he planned to use to send in some elite forces to take it from the inside with the least amount of blood spilled. Naturally included himself as well. Sighing, Blake turned around on his horse and made his way back to his tent. Getting off the steed, Blake patted the mane of the animal, a bit wary after riding the white stallion. Rode a horse much and had indeed preferred to walk with the men when marching. His advisers, even Shirzwa and Bulat, told him that the would-be king could not walk on the ground with the common soldiers. No, a king must ride a noble steed into battle, they said. Least for the marching it seemed, since they all knew that he was far faster than a normal horse when it came to battle. Being a king is far more complicated than I initially thought, he asked the horse, not expecting a response from the animal. He got a nod from the white horse though, as if the steed understood him at that moment. Blake couldn't help but laugh after a moment, now understanding what Noctis had said about this one being the most intelligent of the bunch when he'd gone to pick a horse from the remaining mounts. After his laughter abated though, Blake took on a thinking expression before seemingly coming to a decision. You know, I've been riding you for a little while now and all I've ever called you is boy. Think that doesn't fit a smart one like yourself. So how about instead I call you? Lucian told me that a hero named Heracles rode a horse named that, so I shall call you that as a reference to the steed, Blake said, and nodded to himself before giving the stallion one last pat on the neck before turning to go back into his tent. For some reason, he felt a bit tired and he didn't know why. So he decided to lay down in his tent for a short while before calling his war council. As he laid down, Blake was entirely unaware of the faint glow coming from the now named Arion. Edited, March 16, 2026. Chapter End notes: I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote after you remove the spaces. Chapter 70, Chapter 65. Chapter Notes A/N. A new stat sheet is out now that shows the current status of the characters. Something that interests you, I invite you to check it out. Thank you for reading, and I hope you enjoy the new chapter. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Ramiris found herself near the peak of a mountain, craters littering the landscape with fist-shaped indents in many of them. The sight made her release a fond sigh as she walked forth. The place hadn't changed much to her eyes in all the years it had been since she'd last made the trek here. Bar a few new craters, of course. Nephilim had a habit of releasing her frustrations on the land around her domicile from time to time. The occasional nightmare of those dark days that birthed the destroyer being the main cause the elemental queen knew. The greed and foolishness of that man, I shall never understand it, the fairy thought to herself with a shake of her head before focusing once more on the present. Soon enough she found herself before the entrance to the cave that served as Nephilim's home. This was the place the girl had retreated to after sealing her beloved companion, and had since made this the place she called home. Ramiris wondered if it was in part due to her dragon nature that the cave felt so comforting to her, or if perhaps it was something else that made it so attractive a domicile for the pink-haired tornado. Before Ramiris walked any further though an idea came to her. A smile covered her face then, and a swirl of light covered her form. Once the light died down in place of the regal woman she once was, now her previous pixie form floated. This was part of her revenge on Nephilim for all the pranks she pulled on her over the years. It was only possible for her to pull this off due to two things. First was how she had been suppressing her aura and presence since she had arrived. Didn't want to startle anyone with the sudden appearance of someone as strong as her. She may not be as strong as she will be once she regains everything in a year's time, she was still solidly on par with a true demon lord in terms of strength. If anything, her becoming a demon lord back then had weakened her instead of increasing her power like the process did for others. Second though was the regaining of her extra skill, universal shapeshift. Acquired this skill back before her fall, it was useful for traveling around the world without gaining too much attention. So, she used the skill to change back into her pixie appearance. In truth though, she was far more than a pixie, returning to her original race of royal fae. The intrinsic skills of which included law manipulation, create elemental, universal perception, and her unique version of hockey known as Spirit Queen's hockey. Of course Small World was still with her as well, being one of the only ultimate skills that was also an intrinsic skill. This all by itself put her in the upper realm of power in this world, and so it was all the more important that she suppressed her power for now. No need to upset the dragon faithful, after all, she quietly said to herself with a small snicker at the name of Nephilim's followers. After that though she decided there had been enough stalling on her part. Taking a steadying breath and putting all her rusty acting skills to use to assume her old persona, Ramiris floated, and so, for the first time in many years, the elemental queen had come to visit the dragon. Nephilim sat on her stone throne, something given to her millennia ago shortly after her ascension to the position of demon lord by Guy. He'd called it an awakening present. Though she knew it was more so something he did to try and cheer her up at the time. Apparently according to Guy, no demon lord was complete without a proper throne. Mun was extra like that though she didn't really mind. She was pretty eccentric herself after the dragonoid may come across as an excitable young girl, but she was quite smart in her own right. That wasn't to say that the version of herself that others saw was false though, it was merely just one side to her, and the one she preferred to show the world. It was more fun that way for Nephilim, and she secretly took great joy in annoying stuffy people with her antics, all the while knowing they couldn't do anything due to just how strong she was. It was things like that made it clear to those that knew her that even after all this time, she still wasn't what one might call mature. She'd had no real reason to be though, at least not in her mind. Nephilim had been born powerful, but unlike many that shared this trait with her, she didn't come into existence with a fully matured mind. Beings like Ramiris, the true dragons, and the primordial demons had minds like that of an adult from the very beginning of their existence. They didn't really have a childhood. Nephilim did on account of her human half, something that influenced how she acts in comparison to the others that possess power akin to her own. Even the ones who grew in strength instead of being born strong had to mature in order to gain that power, making them naturally have more maturity by the time they became a demon lord. Nephilim on the other hand became a demon lord due to her grief at the tender age of 14. And she'd since remained in a similar state to that grief-stricken girl. Even her concealed form that she normally took was that of her 14-year-old self. In many ways one could consider Melim to have stopped aging both physically and mentally ever since that day, even with her sharp intelligence. Regardless of all that, Melim sat bored on her throne, looking around at the surrounding treasures that filled the lair that she'd built up over the years. For around her in the sprawling cavern she'd claimed for herself was piles of gold, gems, jewelry, and many other treasures. But one pile there was more wealth than some small nations just laying there, the only reason dust not collecting on it being the magic Melim had set up to prevent it. She liked her hoard shiny, but didn't wish to bother maintaining it herself, so she'd gotten some wards set up in the cave that did it for her. The one she'd paid to do that had been nervous, but happy considering he'd left with more gold than he himself weighed. That had been several centuries ago though, and the hoard had only grown since. It wasn't just gold and jewels though, there was also some furniture that Melim had taken a fancy to over the years and some armories filled with clothes she'd had made as well that she liked. Was anything of value that she came across in her long life that was added to her collection, anything that wasn't in the hands of someone else's mind. Melim wasn't really one to steal, though that may have been helped by the fact that many were so scared of her that if she said she wanted something they usually just gave it to her. That's actually how she'd gotten some of the art that lay in the cave, not knowing at all how rare they were and only knowing that they looked pretty. Though to be honest she probably wouldn't really care if she did know. That was just how she was. Mayan. I'm so freaking bored. I wonder what the newbies are doing. Maybe they're doing something interesting, it's been a few decades since I visited them after all, thought to herself while releasing a huff of bored frustration. It was shortly after having this thought, and her pondering on whether or not she should go see the newbies Carrion, Fry, and Clayman that something prickled her senses. Presence had entered her lair, something normally so weak she'd never even give it a second, but there was something unique in this presence, something familiar that she'd long since memorized. It was one of her oldest friends, and the subject of one of her few shames. It was Ramiris that she sensed. Melim was a bit taken back, not having expected the Queen of the Spirits to come visit her. Especially not so soon into her new incarnation's life while she was so weak. Normally it'd be Melim visiting her in the dwelling of spirits instead of this happening, at least until towards the middle of her reincarnation cycle at least. To be honest, the Dragonoid was worried a bit. At the turn of events, Ramiris shouldn't leave so casually all by herself like this. It'd be one thing if she had some kind of guard or attendant that could protect her, a whole other thing for her to come and Melim could sense no being in several miles that could potentially be any form of attendant or bodyguard. That meant either one of two things in her mind. Either one, this incarnation of Ramiris was stupid, or two, the fairy was in trouble. She really hoped it was only the former and not the latter. Because if it was the latter, Satinel may need to be used to remind the world why one did not mess with her friends. Wouldn't be the first time. After all, it was only due to Guy talking her down that Leon didn't get a punch to the face after the stunt he pulled with Ramiris years ago. This was all considered by her in less than a millisecond through thought acceleration. Left plenty of time for Melim to go get a small chair she had specially made for Ramiris's smaller form. She could be considerate when she wanted to be after all. It didn't take long after that for the small buzzing form of the blonde fairy to enter the main chamber where Melim resided. "It's good to see you," the tiny pixie shouted out with glee, childish voice ringing out through the cave. "It's good to see you too, Ramiris. I'm a bit surprised to see you come all the way out here to visit little ol' me." Melim responded in a similar way to the little queen. "It doesn't seem like she's in trouble, that's good. Seems I won't have to give anyone a reminder as to why I'm called the Destroyer, after all," the pink-haired girl thought to herself while not letting her thoughts show on her face. The childlike voice of Ramiris made a small shard of guilt stab into her like it always did. Had been many years, but a part of her still couldn't stop feeling guilty about the fairy's situation. In Melim's eyes it was her fault that her friend was like this, the original Ramiris. Needing to intervene in her and Guy's fight, oh so long ago, to snap her out of her rampage. Because she lacked control over her own power. Guy would never admit it, but Melim thought he felt a bit guilty too. It was part of the reason why he didn't tolerate any threats towards Ramiris from the other demon lords in his presence. One fool found that out the hard way at Valpurgis in the old days, and to say the result hadn't been pretty would be an understatement. So what brings you here, Ramiris? You don't typically come visit me like this, Melim asked the question that had plagued her mind since sensing the small fairy. The blonde pixie twirled into the air before striking a pose. With hands on her hips and a beaming grin, she answered the dragon princess. I have a surprise. Something super cool. A new friend helped me out with it and everything, she told her, a joy in her that Melim chalked up to her new personality this incarnation. Melim was a bit intrigued by this mention of a new friend though. The Pinkette knew that few would grab the fairy's attention enough to call them a friend regardless of the incarnation of. She giggled a bit at the thought that apparently high standards were such a core trait for Ramiris. Her curiosity thoroughly intrigued, she asked for the little ruler to elaborate. Oh really? Well, I hope it's really good then, not much can impress me after all. Dragonoid proclaimed with a haughty tone to her voice as she pointed towards herself with her right thumb at the end. To be honest, she didn't have her expectations too high for this. That was until Melim heard something that made her stop dead in her tracks, Ramiris's voice. Well then Melim, I think this should be sufficient, don't you think? The far more mature and regal voice that left the small floating pixie was so startlingly different to her ears that Melim could do nothing but freeze in place. That voice wasn't just a surprise because of its deeper tone, no, it was something much more than that. Melim ear, her unique skill born from her desire to understand all she heard, told her that this voice carried something that Ramiris hadn't in thousands of years. Royal barring. A motherly lift. Power and authority. It wasn't the voice of the pixie Ramiris, but that of the elemental queen Ramiris. And if that wasn't enough, before her stunned eyes the small blonde form of her friend was engulfed in a burst of light. A burst of light that revealed the fully adult and original form of the queen in all her glory once it faded away. Melim felt she could be forgiven for her reaction to the events playing out before her. Were the 3 words uttered from her stunned mouth, swearing not something that she normally did, but her vocabulary lacked any better words to express herself in this moment. The queenly laughter that came from the now seemingly restored Ramiris didn't help the situation she felt. Lucian sat in his room, having just recently finished relaying what had occurred with Ramiris to his companions. Only 2 of them showed the same level of surprise at the stunt the elemental queen pulled with his teleportation, and those were Alice and Kushina. Understood just how absurd one's control over the spatial attribute needed to be in order to do something like that due to her magical studies. It was one thing to disrupt one's spatial manipulation through things like ANIT magic barriers or spatial jamming. That was common, even Albies had spatial suppression under her unique skill after all. But to hijack another's spell like that was a whole other thing. The implications of which were horrifying to consider. For if one didn't know their opponent could do something like that, then their retreat could become their death. After all, with that level of control over someone's teleportation spell, it would be all too easy to change the destination without them. Suddenly your escape to somewhere safe instead could make you die instantly by making you appear in the vacuum of space or the core of the planet if one were to go to the. Meanwhile, Kushina knew how difficult anything related to spatial manipulation was. Husband was infamous for his spatial technique after all. The thought that one could manipulate that without his knowledge was terrifying. If someone in her world had the ability to do something like that, then the Yellow Flash, one of the strongest shinobi of her generation, would have been more than dead. It would have turned one of the most feared techniques in her world into a death sentence. The others didn't truly get the implications of this, and Lucian was more than willing to leave that explanation to Alice. He was tired honestly from naming Ramiris, and the revelation of just what he'd unleashed back into the world. It was a bit much even for him, more so mentally than anything. So he decided to take some time to collect himself with some peaceful meditation after they left his room. It was a few hours later, now the dead of night, that he'd fully recovered. During his meditation though, Lucian was reminded of an idea he'd had but hadn't properly started to implement yet. So deciding now was as good a time as any, he decided to start testing to see if his idea held water, so to speak. With a breath he accessed his spatial storage, something that made him realize that the space was no longer so secure with people like Ramiris existing, and making him suppress a shiver, and took out his beloved Graham. Laying Graham across his lap as he sat crisscross on the stone floor, Lucian focused on the blade intently, stretching his senses to their limit while focusing them solely on his sword. Like a microscope, Lucian searched for something he knew was there. It took a little while, not having Puriel to aid him, making it take longer than usual, but he found it in the end. Metaphysical space inside Graham, where the blade stored the factor of slain dragons. Once he properly got a feel for where it was, Lucian reached out to the space. He somewhat expected resistance to meet him. This was for all intents and purposes him reaching out to something close to the forming soul of the blade. However, instead of any rejection, he felt a feeling of warm acceptance flow into him before seemingly being ushered on in. Just how much Graham was developing and how fast as well, not to mention the amount of trust his weapon had in him to allow such a thing based on instinct alone. Smiling at what had occurred, Lucian focused once more, this time inwards. While he kept the connection to the space inside Graham, he also split his attention to something he hadn't messed with too much within him, his complete draconic core. Now that he could produce his own dragon factor through the skill, he decided to explore what he could do with this strange and unexplored power. The first use of which was what he was trying to accomplish now, flowing his produced factor into Graham. It was difficult to grasp the strange energy that existed within the core, like trying to grasp smoke or tame lightning. Eventually though, after who knows how long, Lucian grasped what he needed to do. Instead of bending it to his will as that seemed somewhat beyond the current him, he made a path from it to Graham. This served like a conductor, or a wire that the factor flowed through to its new home. It was only Lucian's knowledge of how electrical systems worked from his 20th century education that the idea came to him to even try. The fact that it worked was more so something that he'd been wishing for rather than something he knew would work, his countless other attempted methods being proof of how blind he was going into this. Graham seemed to sing in his hands, a sense through his soul telling him that his blade was satisfied. Or at least as close as its still-forming self could get to expressing that. It drank the factor he directed to it, soaking it in like a sponge, and when Lucian opened his eyes he saw Graham glowing with energy. A golden swirl seemed to be present within the metal of the blade, looking like a whirlpool of power flowing inward. It was mesmerizing to his eyes, and he simply held this until his reserve of dragon factor ran dry. The glow took a moment to disappear, and when it did it left behind Graham looking like it did, but that was only to normal eyes that couldn't see deeper, and if one didn't have access to senses beyond the norm. Both those things were things Lucian possessed, so he was able to see the changes. His blade had grown stronger, its soul more complete. The process of awakening a soul in Graham had been sped up through what he just did. It overall gave him hope that in time, after enough sessions of this, Graham would grow to even greater heights. And maybe, just maybe, he'd be able to say hello to the sword that had served him well far sooner than expected. One could only dream after all. I wonder if Blake will be jealous that I'll have a sentient sword before him, Lucian thought to himself with a small chuckle at the thought of how his brother would react to hearing that. Edited, March 20, 2026. Chapter End Notes. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote, after you remove the spaces. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Novels Wonderland.